Have you ever noticed how quickly we pass by people who look like they have nothing left to lose? You see them at the grocery store, quietly counting out coins to pay for milk, or sitting alone on a park bench, staring at nothing in particular. Maybe you nod politely or offer a tight smile before hurrying on, convinced you're not like them. But the truth is, no one expects their life to shrink to a single room or a single memory. No one thinks it will be their turn to face the kind of loneliness that makes a person forget the sound of their own laughter. Before you judge, remember, sometimes, the smallest moment can split a life in two. Sometimes, a choice you make in a single heartbeat can define everything that follows. Welcome to Grandma's Stories. If this tale touches your heart, consider subscribing to our channel so you never miss the next one. Now, take a breath. This is where the story begins. It was the first week of October when the rain settled over the town like a punishment. For 3 days, it poured with a bitter persistence that turned the gravel roads into thick ribbons of mud. Inside the weathered cabin that sat alone at the edge of the Elkhorn River, Martha Holcomb pressed her hand against the cold windowpane. She had not spoken to anyone since Tuesday. She was not sure if that was a blessing or something worse. When you've been widowed as long as she had, you stop expecting conversation to fill the rooms, but you never quite stop noticing how quiet your own breathing sounds in the dark. That evening, as the sky sank into a darker shade of slate, she lit the last candle she kept in the drawer beside the stove. The electric lamp had sputtered out hours before, and she hadn't found the energy to fiddle with the fuse box. She sat in her chair, her knees wrapped in a faded quilt, watching the wick burn low. Maybe she would sleep in the chair tonight. The thought of climbing the creaking stairs seemed like a labor she couldn't justify. Outside, the river had swelled beyond the reeds. When the wind shifted, she thought she heard something more than rain. A thin, quivering sound she couldn't place. She held herself still, listening. There it was again, a cry, high and sharp, tangled with the gusts. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of the storm. Yet her body had already risen, her hand pressing against the door, as if some other part of her knew better. The moment she opened the door, the wind seized the air from her lungs. She stood blinking against the pelting rain, her eyes sweeping the yard and the ragged line of the river. The cry came again, closer this time, more desperate. Martha stepped off the porch, her boots sinking into the sodden grass. Every instinct screamed to go back inside, to let the river keep its secrets. But she kept moving, each step heavier than the last, until she reached the water's edge. There, caught among the swirling debris, was a shape that didn't belong. A makeshift raft, a shallow crate lashed together with rope, half submerged, and inside it, a bundle of white cloth. She thought her heart had stopped. She waded in without thinking, the cold biting through her skirts, gripping her legs in 1,000 cruel hands. When her fingers closed around the crate's edge, she almost couldn't bear to look, but she did. Nestled in the wet linen was a baby, no older than a few weeks, her tiny mouth open in a silent scream the river was trying to swallow. Martha's hands shook so violently she could barely lift the child free. She clutched the small body to her chest, feeling the brittle warmth beneath the soaked blanket. The baby's eyelids fluttered, as if she too was deciding whether to trust the world a little longer. Martha turned and fought her way back toward the cabin, every step a battle. The rain pressed down with the weight of regret and something more dangerous. Inside, she set the baby on the table, stripping away the soaked wrappings. The little girl's skin was pale, her breaths thin as spider threads. Martha rubbed her arms briskly, whispering nonsense, because it was the only language left to her. She found a towel and wrapped it around the child, willing her own warmth into the frail body. When she dared to look again, she saw 2 dark eyes fixed on her face, calm and impossibly deep, as if this tiny creature knew something Martha had forgotten long ago. She should have called the sheriff, should have lifted the phone and declared she had found an abandoned infant on her property, but as she looked into those eyes, she knew she would not. Whatever this child's story was, it had found its ending here, with her. She lifted the girl gently and carried her to the old rocking chair by the fire. She sat down, cradling the small weight in her arms, feeling the heat seep back into fragile limbs. In the hush between the gusts, Martha spoke aloud, her voice rough with disuse. "You don't have a name, do you?" "Well, you do now." She hesitated, pressing her cheek against the baby's damp hair. "Your name is Elena. Because you came to me in the darkness, and maybe you'll teach me to believe in something again." Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the cabin, something quiet had settled. A promise, unspoken but absolute. In that moment, Martha Holcomb understood that her life had just been divided into before and after, and she could never return to the emptiness she had known. Morning slipped into the cabin without asking permission, carrying the scent of damp earth and something cleaner, like a chance to begin again. Martha woke with a start, her neck aching from the hours spent sleeping upright. For a moment, she didn't remember why her arms felt heavy, why her heart was both frightened and strangely alive. Then she looked down and saw Elena, still wrapped in the towel, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. In the pale light, the baby's face looked more peaceful than any face Martha had seen in years. She shifted carefully, afraid to disturb the fragile calm. A sigh escaped her lips, mingling with the hush that lingered after the storm. Outside, the river had retreated to its banks, leaving a skin of silt across the grass. The world looked like it had been washed clean, as if the rain had decided to forgive everything it could. But Martha knew forgiveness was never that simple. She carried Elena to the kitchen table and laid her gently in the center. The thought came, unbidden, that she should feed her, though she had never prepared a bottle in her life. Her hands felt clumsy as she searched through the cabinets. There was an unopened tin of powdered milk someone had given her last Christmas, probably out of pity. At the time, she'd set it aside, thinking she'd never have a reason to use it. Now she unscrewed the lid and measured the powder with fingers that trembled. She boiled water and mixed it, stirring until the lumps dissolved. When the baby finally took the bottle, her small mouth worked with fierce determination, as if survival were something she'd already decided on long before Martha had found her. Watching her drink, Martha felt a strange pride swell in her chest, mingled with the old ache she thought she'd buried years ago. She hadn't allowed herself to remember the child she'd lost so long ago, a daughter who had lived only a handful of days. That sorrow had been folded away, hidden behind the practical demands of survival. But now it came back in waves, not to destroy her, but to remind her how much she still felt. Once Elena finished, Martha cleaned her carefully, then found a soft flannel cloth to wrap her in. The towel had cooled and dampened, and she didn't want the baby to shiver. As she tucked the cloth around her, she noticed for the first time that a small tag had been sewn to one corner. The thread was a bright silver, and the letters stitched there were clear enough to read, E.M. She brushed her fingertip over them and wondered whose initials they were. Someone who had loved this child enough to leave a mark of ownership, or at least remembrance. But love could be a clumsy thing, she knew. It didn't always look the way you hoped it would. A knock at the door startled her. The sound seemed too loud for the quiet morning. She hesitated, her pulse quickening, then set Elena back in the rocker. She crossed the room, pausing with her hand on the latch. No one ever came this early unless something was wrong. When she opened the door, she found her neighbor, Ruth, standing with a basket clutched to her hip. Ruth's face was red from the chill, her hair tucked under a knitted cap. "Morning, Martha," she said, her eyes drifting past her into the cabin. "I came to check on you. That storm was no small thing. I was worried your chimney might have come down." Martha felt the old instinct to hide what she didn't want to explain, but it was too late. Ruth's gaze settled on the rocker, where Elena's small form shifted beneath the flannel. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ruth stepped closer, lowering her voice to a tone reserved for secrets. "Martha, what on earth? Whose baby is that?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice so quiet she barely heard it herself. "I found her in the river last night." Ruth's mouth fell open. "You found her? Alive?" She nodded. "I don't know how she survived, but she did, and now, I suppose she's mine to care for." Ruth looked at her with something like pity, or maybe concern, but she didn't argue. Instead, she set the basket on the floor and pulled out a folded blanket and a glass jar of applesauce. "You'll need these. Babies can't wait while you figure out what to do next." Martha accepted the gifts with gratitude she couldn't express. For all the gossip Ruth enjoyed, she had always been decent when it counted. They stood together for a long moment, listening to Elena's soft breathing, then Ruth sighed. You'll have to tell someone, the sheriff, at least. People will ask questions. I'm not ready yet, Martha said. I need time to understand what this means. Ruth looked as if she wanted to argue, but she only nodded. Just be careful. Folks can be unkind when they don't understand something. After Ruth left, Martha closed the door and leaned against it, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She knew her neighbor was right. But she couldn't bear the thought of handing Elena over to strangers who would measure her worth with forms and signatures. In her heart, she had already decided. This child was not a burden or a problem. She was a gift, however improbable. Martha returned to the rocker, gathering Elena in her arms again. The baby's eyelids fluttered, then opened wide, studying her face with an unsettling focus, as if she were trying to decide whether Martha belonged to her yet. Maybe it was foolish to think a baby could claim someone, but that was exactly how it felt. For the rest of the morning, Martha moved slowly around the cabin, her every action shaped by the presence of this small, silent witness. She warmed bottles, tidied the hearth, folded linens with more care than she'd shown in years. Each task was a prayer she didn't know how to say out loud, a promise that she would not fail this child, no matter what it cost her. And when the river finally gleamed under the first pale strip of sun, Martha knew her life had already changed beyond anything she could have imagined. By the time the afternoon drifted across the valley, Martha had lost track of the hours. She kept expecting some official impulse to rise in her, some sensible voice to insist she pick up the telephone and report what she had found, but no such voice came. Instead, her mind remained oddly quiet, as if every doubt and fear had stepped aside to let her feel nothing but this new, bewildering attachment. She watched Elena sleep, tiny hands curled beneath her chin. Each small breath seemed to confirm something Martha wasn't ready to name. She caught herself imagining what the child's laughter would sound like, how it might feel to lift her up and spin her in the kitchen until they were both dizzy. She knew it was dangerous to hope for anything beyond the next day, but hope had a way of growing where it wasn't invited. Late in the afternoon, Martha realized she needed supplies. She had enough powdered milk for one more feeding, and no diapers at all. The thought of leaving Elena alone, even for an hour, turned her stomach cold. But she could not pretend this was a situation she could manage without help. Carefully, she wrapped Elena in the warmest quilt she owned, then set her inside the old wicker cradle she had stored in the attic. The cradle had belonged to her grandmother, though no baby had ever slept in it since Martha herself. She wiped away the dust and carried it into the sitting room, placing it near the stove. When she was sure Elena would be safe, she pulled on her coat and slipped out the door. The sky had turned a tender blue, streaked with ribbons of pink that made the river look harmless again. She knew better than to trust appearances. As she walked the half-mile into town, every step felt exposed. She could not shake the certainty that someone would see right through her, would know she was carrying a secret too big to keep. But no one stopped her. The store was nearly empty, only the owner, Mr. Carver, and a young woman stocking cans along the far aisle. Martha forced herself to walk steadily to the back shelves, where the baby supplies waited. Her hands hovered over the rows of formula and jars of strained vegetables, feeling out of place. When had her life become so unfamiliar? She selected a canister of milk, a small pack of diapers, and a soft yellow blanket she had no real reason to buy, except that it looked like something a loved child ought to have. At the counter, Mr. Carver gave her a polite nod. His eyes rested on the formula, then lifted to meet hers with quiet curiosity. "Didn't know you were expecting visitors, Martha," he said in his careful, kindly way. She tried to keep her voice steady. "It's not exactly planned." He waited, as though expecting more explanation, but she offered none. After a moment, he tapped his fingers lightly on the counter. "Well, if you need anything else, you just say so." He bagged her purchases without further comment, though she could feel the questions radiating from him like heat from a stove. The walk home felt longer. Each footstep seemed to echo the unspoken truths she hadn't dared to share. By the time she reached the cabin, the last of the daylight was sliding behind the hills. She paused on the porch, taking a moment to breathe in the hush that settled between day and night. She thought she understood now why she hadn't called the authorities. Because the moment she told someone, Elena would stop being a gift and start being a case to be resolved, and she wasn't ready to let that happen. Inside, she set the bag of supplies on the table and went straight to the cradle. Elena lay awake, eyes wide, as if she had been waiting. Martha felt a rush of relief so fierce it made her knees weak. She lifted the baby, pressing her close. The soft weight in her arms felt like proof she hadn't imagined any of it. "I'm here," she murmured, though she didn't know if she was saying it to Elena or herself. "I'm here, and you're safe." She fed the baby slowly, her hands growing steadier with each passing minute. As the bottle emptied, Martha watched the tiny mouth slacken, the eyelids droop. When she was sure Elena had fallen asleep again, she laid her gently back in the cradle. She stood over her, brushing her fingertips across the pale cheek, feeling a tenderness so bright it almost hurt. Then she noticed the folded cloth tucked under the quilt. She hadn't seen it before, hadn't noticed it in the dark confusion of the rescue. Carefully, she drew it out. It was a square of fine linen, embroidered with a delicate pattern of leaves and tiny stars. In one corner, the same letters appeared again, E.M. She traced the stitches with her thumb. Someone had sewn this by hand, someone who cared enough to mark it with initials. For the first time, Martha felt the flicker of dread. There was a story behind this child, a story that would eventually come knocking on her door. Yet when she looked down at Elena, she couldn't imagine any force strong enough to pry them apart. The feeling startled her. It was too early, too sudden, but it was real. She sat in the rocker, holding the cloth in her lap, and tried to remember the last time she had been so certain of anything. Outside, the first stars were waking in the darkening sky. The river had fallen silent, its surface smooth to glass. She wondered if it was content now that it had given up one secret, or if it was merely waiting to see what she would do next. In the quiet, Martha allowed herself one small, defiant thought. Whatever came for them, questions, judgments, consequences, she would be ready. Because sometimes, she realized, the heart makes its own decisions before the mind can catch up, and no amount of logic could convince her this child didn't belong right here, in her arms, where the river had carried her. By the second day, the cabin seemed to have rearranged itself around Elena, as if every corner had been waiting for her presence. Martha woke before dawn, her body stiff from a night of half-sleep, every dream knotted with images of water and small hands reaching through the darkness. She rose carefully, mindful not to stir the bundle sleeping in the rocker beside her bed. The child had not cried once in the night. It was a quiet that felt both merciful and unnerving. In the fragile blue hour before sunrise, Martha boiled water for her own coffee. The scent rose in the kitchen, blending with the soft sweetness of powdered milk. She poured a cup and sat at the table, her gaze resting on the initials sewn into Elena's cloth, E.M. The letters looked almost deliberate, as though they had been left to remind her that this child had come from somewhere, someone, yet no matter how long she stared, she could not will the truth to appear. The sun climbed slowly over the riverbank, lighting the frost that clung to every blade of grass. Martha watched it melt in delicate rivulets, feeling the day beginning in earnest. She knew she couldn't hide forever behind the locked door. If she didn't visit the store soon, there would be questions anyway. Ruth would have mentioned the baby to someone, probably everyone. Small towns had a way of passing stories from porch to porch, the details swelling like a river after rain. Still, she hesitated, staring at Elena's sleeping face. There was a comfort in these early hours, in the hush that hadn't yet been interrupted by the world's expectations. But necessity had its own voice, and it was louder than her reluctance. She dressed in her thickest sweater, pulling her hair back with a worn ribbon. The mirror over the basin reflected a woman who looked older than she felt, her mouth set in lines she'd never tried to soften. She traced the curve of her cheek with a fingertip, wondering if Elena would ever see her as something more than the woman who'd pulled her from the river. When she lifted the child into her arms, Elena stirred and made a small, questioning sound. Martha pressed her lips to the baby's temple, surprised by how instinctual it felt. No words came, but she carried her to the rocker and settled her gently among the folded blankets. She propped the bottle in place, watching as the baby latched on, her eyes drifting shut with each swallow. For a moment, Martha allowed herself to imagine this was how it had always been. No storm, no strangers, no terrible uncertainty, just a woman and a child sharing the quiet miracle of an ordinary morning. After Elena had eaten, Martha bundled her into the carrier she'd found in the attic, a relic from a time she'd thought she might fill her house with children. The faded straps held a memory of another life she'd almost lived. She adjusted them over her shoulder, feeling the weight of Elena settle against her chest. The warmth seeped through the layers of cloth, and some of the dread receded. She stepped onto the porch, squinting into the cold. The world looked deceptively peaceful, the river sliding past as if it had never carried any secrets at all. Walking into town took longer than usual. Every few steps, she checked to be sure Elena was breathing. Each glance revealed the small rise and fall of her chest, a reassurance Martha needed more than she would admit. When she reached the general store, she paused outside the door, her reflection rippling in the glass. She knew once she stepped inside, the questions would come, and she would have to find answers she didn't have. The bell chimed when she entered, and the hush that followed was immediate. Two women at the counter turned in unison, their gazes settling on the baby strapped to Martha's front. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Mr. Jensen, who had run the store longer than anyone could remember, cleared his throat. "Martha, morning. Looks like you've had quite a week." Her mouth felt dry. "Morning. I suppose you have." The women exchanged a look. One of them, Evelyn Price, who never missed a chance to narrate other people's lives, took a step closer. "Whose baby?" she asked, her tone bright with curiosity that bordered on accusation. "I don't know yet," Martha said carefully. "I found her after the storm. She was caught in the driftwood by my bank." Evelyn's eyes widened. "Alive? All night out there?" "Yes." "Well, my word, that's a miracle," the other woman whispered. Maybe it was, or maybe it was something harder to explain. Martha moved past them, her attention fixed on the shelves. She gathered what she needed: more powdered milk, a bundle of diapers, a tin of salve for the baby's raw cheeks. Each item felt like a declaration. "I will care for her. I will not pretend she isn't here." At the counter, Mr. Jensen rang up her purchases in silence. When he handed her the receipt, his hand brushed hers. His voice was softer than she expected. "You did the right thing, Martha, no matter what anyone says." She nodded, unable to trust her voice. She adjusted the strap across her shoulder, feeling Elena shift against her. The baby's small hand curled over the edge of the carrier, as if claiming her without hesitation. Outside, the wind had picked up again, tugging at the edge of Martha's coat. She drew it tight and began the walk home. As the road unwound before her, she realized she was no longer simply a woman living out her days in quiet resignation. Something had changed in her, something she didn't fully recognize yet. A resolve, maybe, or a kind of fierce tenderness that made her feel unafraid of what might come. She looked down at Elena's face, peaceful in sleep, and thought, whatever story brought you here, it will end differently this time. The path back to the cabin felt shorter than before, though Martha knew it was only her thoughts that had changed. Each step carried a strange lightness, as though the burden she'd feared was instead something she could bear without resentment. By the time she reached the porch, the afternoon sun had broken through the gauzy clouds, casting the yard in a brilliance she had almost forgotten existed. She paused there, letting the warmth settle on her shoulders, feeling the steady weight of Elena pressed against her chest. For an instant, she felt as if she were standing at the beginning of something she did not yet understand. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and old books, scents she had come to think of as her only companions. She unbuckled the carrier with careful hands, lifting Elena into the curve of her arms. The baby stirred, her eyelids fluttering open, and for the first time, she smiled. It was not the full, unguarded smile of an older child, but a tentative, searching thing. Still, it struck Martha so deeply she had to close her eyes against the sudden flood of feeling. She pressed her lips to the baby's forehead, breathing in the faint sweetness of her skin, and felt something within her loosen. She settled Elena in the basket she had lined with a folded quilt. The basket had belonged to her own mother, used for carrying apples from the orchard every autumn. It felt right that it should hold something precious again. As she adjusted the edges of the cloth, she heard a soft knock at the door. Her chest tightened. She knew it would not be long before the sheriff came, before questions she could not answer pressed into her quiet refuge. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find Ruth again, this time holding a paper sack in one hand. Her expression was softer than it had been that morning. "I thought you might need this," she said, lifting the bag. "Formula, some bottles, a few things I had stored from when my granddaughter visited." Martha stepped aside to let her in. "Thank you. I didn't expect you to come back so soon." Ruth set the bag on the table and turned to look at Elena, who lay blinking up at the beams overhead. "It's a wonder she survived that storm. It's not something you see every day." "No," Martha agreed, her voice hushed. She didn't know how to explain the certainty she felt that this child was meant for her. That finding her was not an accident or a burden but something closer to a second chance. She only knew it was true. Ruth folded her arms, studying Martha with an expression that was difficult to read. "Do you think you'll keep her?" Martha hesitated, her hands settling on the back of a chair. "I don't know what will happen, but I can't imagine sending her away. Not after everything." "That's what I thought you'd say," Ruth murmured. She reached out, brushing Elena's tiny hand with a fingertip. "Whatever people are saying in town, it's not their business to decide. You've always had more heart than most." Martha swallowed the sudden tightness in her throat. She had never thought of herself as someone who was brave. Most days, she had only been trying to survive the emptiness. But perhaps it took a different kind of courage to keep going, when no one was watching. When Ruth finally left, the house felt even quieter, the stillness almost tender. Martha lit the small lamp on the table, watching the circle of light spread across the floorboards. She found herself speaking aloud, though she hadn't planned to. "I suppose we'll figure this out together," she whispered, as if Elena could understand her. "Whatever comes, we'll find a way." She busied herself through the rest of the afternoon, arranging the new supplies Ruth had brought. Each objective bottle, each folded cloth felt like a promise she had made without realizing it. As she worked, she glanced over at the basket where Elena slept, the baby's breathing slow and even. It astonished her how quickly that sound had become something she depended on. By evening, the wind had returned, rattling the loose shutter beside the window. She built a small fire and sat in her rocker, holding Elena close. Outside, the river moved with its patient current, as though it had already forgotten the night it carried a child to her doorstep. She knew the town would not forget so easily. Soon, questions would come from the authorities, polite inquiries about how she had found the baby and what she intended to do. But for tonight, she allowed herself the small comfort of pretending it was only the two of them in the world. As darkness deepened, Martha sang a lullaby she hadn't sung in decades, her voice rough but steady. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the baby's cheek against her collarbone. For the first time in years, she felt she was part of something unfolding, a story that had no script she could read ahead of time. It was terrifying in its uncertainty, but there was also a flicker of hope she could not deny. The last thought she had before drifting into sleep was that perhaps loneliness was not the natural state she had believed it to be. Perhaps it was only the waiting room for something braver, something truer. In the gentle hush of that night, with the fire murmuring low and the river whispering beyond the walls, she let herself believe that even an old woman who had lost everything could be given a chance to start again. When morning arrived, it found Martha already awake, her thoughts circling the same questions she had tried to ignore. She sat in her rocker long after dawn had poured across the worn floorboards, her hands resting lightly on the curve of Elena's back. The baby lay nestled against her chest, still lost in sleep, her breath a soft warmth that steadied Martha in ways she couldn't name. She wondered if this was what it meant to feel needed. To sense your purpose every time a small hand curled against your skin. Eventually, she set Elena gently in the basket and rose to begin the day's chores. There was a comfort in the old routine, stacking wood by the stove, sweeping the grit from the threshold, checking the larder to see what little she might stretch into meals. Yet nothing felt quite the same as before. Every task was now measured against the presence of this small life she had rescued, every decision carrying the weight of someone else's well-being. It was humbling, and it was frightening, but it was also a quiet kind of joy she had not believed herself worthy to feel. After she had tidied the kitchen, Martha unwrapped the bundle of things Ruth had brought. She inspected each bottle, each folded cloth, each small item meant for a baby's care. She tried to imagine herself as the sort of woman who knew what to do with these things. The thought made her pause, her hand resting on the edge of the counter. In all the years she had lived in that house, she had never expected it to shelter a child. And yet here they were, two souls who might have remained strangers if not for a storm that had decided to rewrite both their fates. She was still standing there when another knock came at the door, firm but not unkind. Her pulse jumped. For an instant she considered pretending she wasn't home, but she knew that was no solution. With a steadying breath, she crossed the room and pulled the door open. Sheriff Alden stood on the porch, his hat in his hands. His face was lined by the years and the work of keeping order in a place too small for secrets to stay hidden long. "Martha," he said, nodding politely. "Morning." "Sheriff," she returned, her voice low, "come in out of the cold." He stepped inside, pausing to stamp the frost from his boots. His eyes drifted immediately to the basket where Elena stirred. Martha could see the questions already forming behind his quiet expression. She braced herself as he settled into the chair opposite her, resting his hat on his knee. "I reckon you know why I'm here," he began gently. "I suppose I do. Ruth stopped by my office yesterday. She told me you'd found the child during the flood. Is that so?" "It is," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "I heard her crying. She was tangled in a drift of branches near my yard. I don't know how she survived the night." He nodded, listening carefully. "And you didn't see anyone else? No sign of who might have left her there?" "None." For a moment, he studied the baby in silence, his gaze thoughtful. Then he looked back at Martha. "You understand I have to make a record of this," he said, his voice patient. "It's not that I doubt you. It's just the law. A child turns up with no explanation, folks will ask questions." "I know," she replied. "I'm not trying to hide anything. I don't think you are, but I have to ask, do you intend to keep her here?" Martha hesitated. She thought of the empty years, of the way the cabin had felt before Elena's arrival. She thought of the night she'd carried the baby out of the river and how, in that moment, she'd known she could never let her go. When she spoke, her words felt heavier than any she had ever spoken. "Yes. If it's allowed. I want to care for her." The sheriff let out a slow breath, as if he'd expected nothing less. "I can't make promises. If someone comes forward, family, or the courts, you may have to let her go. But until that happens, I don't see any harm in you keeping her here, provided you're willing to cooperate with the county." "I understand," Martha said quietly. He pulled a small notebook from his coat and wrote down her account, the scratch of his pencil loud in the stillness. When he finished, he closed the notebook and studied her face with a look that made her chest ache. "You've always been a good woman, Martha. I don't believe you'd take something that wasn't meant for you." "I didn't take her," she whispered. "I found her." "I know. And maybe that's all the difference in the world." When he left, she stood in the doorway, watching his figure retreat down the path toward town. The cold wind pressed against her cheeks, but she didn't close the door. She felt as though she were standing on a threshold she hadn't chosen, unsure what waited on the other side. Later, as the day slipped toward dusk, she gathered Elena in her arms and settled into the rocker. The baby stirred, her small hand brushing Martha's collar. That simple touch broke something open in her heart, something she hadn't dared to acknowledge. For the first time since Robert had died, she felt that her life was no longer only hers to endure. There was a fragile, luminous promise folded into every moment she spent with this child, a promise she was suddenly certain she would defend at any cost. The fire crackled in the grate, filling the cabin with its gentle warmth. Martha rocked slowly, her gaze fixed on the darkness gathering beyond the window. Whatever tomorrow demanded, she would face it. Because she understood, finally, that she was no longer alone in the world, and neither was Elena. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was as unfamiliar as it was comforting. Martha discovered she no longer moved through her mornings with the dull purpose of simply filling the hours. Now there was always something that needed her attention: a bottle to warm, a blanket to smooth, a small pair of eyes tracking her every motion as if memorizing her face. Each time she looked down and found Elena watching her, she felt a peculiar sense of relief. It was as though the child were quietly confirming that Martha had made the right choice, even if no one else understood. Word spread faster than she would have liked. By the end of the week, Nearly everyone in town knew that Martha Holcomb, who had kept mostly to herself for years, was now caring for a baby no one could account for. When she walked to the post office, people glanced up from their conversations and let their eyes linger a moment too long. A few offered polite questions she pretended not to hear. Others looked at her with curiosity that felt more like suspicion. She told herself she didn't care, but when she returned to her cabin and shut the door behind her, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The sheriff returned on Thursday afternoon. He knocked softly and waited, the same patient expression on his weathered face when she opened the door. He didn't step inside at first, only stood there, his hat in one hand, as if trying to measure how much this visit might disrupt the fragile peace she'd built. "I won't stay long," he began. "I just need to update you on what we've learned." She stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. The baby was resting in her basket near the stove, a quilt tucked snug around her. The sheriff's gaze softened when he looked at her, and Martha felt her shoulders ease a fraction. "No reports of missing infants anywhere in the county," he said as he settled into the chair. "We've contacted agencies in the neighboring areas, but so far, nothing." Martha swallowed. "And that means?" "It means she may have come from farther than we thought, or it means whoever left her didn't intend to be found." The words lodged in her chest, a quiet ache she could neither refute nor accept. She glanced toward the basket, watching Elena's small hands twitch in sleep. In the silence, the sheriff studied her face, his eyes kind but searching. "You should be prepared," he said gently. "If someone comes forward, this arrangement may have to change." "I know," she murmured, "but until that happens, I'll care for her." He nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. "I'm not here to take her away from you. I just needed to be clear." When he left, Martha stood at the window and watched his truck disappear down the track. A cold wind skimmed across the yard, lifting the last dry leaves into restless spirals. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the chill seep into her bones. It struck her that everything she cared about now fit within these four walls. The thought was both terrifying and strangely consoling. That night, she took out the old photo album she hadn't touched in years. She set it on the kitchen table, her fingers hesitating at the cracked leather spine. Page by page, she turned through images of a life that sometimes felt like it belonged to another woman. Her wedding portrait, Robert's hand on her shoulder. A faded picture of the orchard in spring, blossoms clinging to the branches like pale confessions, and near the back, a single photograph of a newborn wrapped in a crocheted blanket. The baby they had lost before she ever learned to cry. Martha closed her eyes, pressing her thumb over the image. For a long time she sat there, listening to the wind tapping against the window pane, wondering what it meant that fate had brought another child to her doorstep so many years later. In the morning, she woke to find Elena already awake, her wide eyes searching the room as if trying to name every shape and shadow. When Martha lifted her into her arms, the baby reached for her cheek, fingers splaying against her skin in a touch so unguarded it nearly broke her. She kissed the small hand and felt a determination take root inside her, a promise she wouldn't let the past steal the present. As the day stretched on, Martha cleaned the pantry and sorted through old jars, tossing what had spoiled in the long months she'd neglected everything but survival. Each task felt lighter than it should have, as if sharing her solitude made the cabin itself warmer. In the quiet moments between chores, she spoke to Elena in a voice she barely recognized. She told her about the orchard that once filled the yard with blossoms, about the man who had built the shelves and carved the rocker by the stove. She told her that some stories were too big for a single heart to carry alone. Near dusk, Ruth appeared again, this time with a bundle of tiny shirts folded neatly under her arm. She didn't ask questions. She only set the clothes on the table and helped Martha hang them by the fire to warm. For a little while, the two women worked side by side, saying nothing that needed explaining. When Ruth left, Martha stood in the doorway and watched her go, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, a sense that perhaps she wasn't alone in her conviction, that love was reason enough to keep going. As the evening settled, she sat by the fire with Elena cradled in her arms, the child's breathing soft against her skin. She closed her eyes and let herself imagine that in another time, another life, she would have sung lullabies without hesitation, believing she was worthy of this tenderness. And in the hush that followed, she knew she had already crossed the line between caretaker and something more permanent. Whatever else happened, she had given her heart to this child. And she was willing to risk everything to keep her safe. By the time winter pressed its cold hands against the valley, the town had settled into a restless curiosity about the baby in Martha's care. Some people were content to let the matter drift into rumor and let the sheriff handle whatever official questions needed asking. Others made a point of stopping Martha whenever she came to town, their voices bright with forced politeness as they tried to coax details she never intended to share. She had learned to answer simply, to smile without encouragement, and to return home as quickly as she could. Whatever they suspected or imagined, none of it mattered when she closed her door behind her. Inside the cabin, life had begun to stretch into a new kind of normal. Each dawn carried the same quiet promise, that there would be warmth to give and work to be done. Elena had learned to smile easily, her mouth curling up in a way that felt like forgiveness for everything Martha had failed to become in her old life. The child's presence made even the simplest tasks feel meaningful again. When Martha fed her, she spoke in a soft voice about all the ordinary things: the shape of the frost on the windows, the sound of the river under ice, the pale sky that turned rose-colored in the evenings. She had never thought herself interesting enough to narrate a day, but Elena listened as if every word mattered. One afternoon near the turn of the year, Martha decided to take Elena for a walk to the edge of the orchard. The snow was shallow there, the old trees casting long blue shadows across the drifts. She bundled the baby into her thickest quilt and held her close against the cold. As she moved between the bare trunks, she remembered the seasons when those branches had been heavy with fruit, when she and Robert had filled baskets until their backs ached. It was a memory she had avoided for so long that it startled her to feel it now without bitterness. She paused beneath the largest tree, the one Robert had planted the year they were married. Its limbs reached wide and unashamed into the sky, a testament to what patience could build over time. Elena stirred, her face pressing against Martha's shoulder. She looked down and felt a sudden rush of protectiveness, so fierce it nearly unseated her. No matter who came to ask for the child, no matter what claims or papers they carried, Martha knew she would not surrender her easily. The realization made her feel stronger and more afraid in the same breath. She turned back toward the cabin, her boots crunching over the crust of snow. The sky had begun to lower into a soft gray dusk, and the river whispered its slow secrets as she passed. Inside, the stove glowed with a steady warmth. She set Elena on a folded blanket and poured herself a cup of tea. Steam rose into the dim air, blurring the edges of the room. For a while she sat there, watching the baby bat at the fringe of the quilt, her small fingers exploring each thread as if she were deciphering a message. Martha felt her throat tighten. If the sheriff returned tomorrow with someone claiming to be family, she would have no right to keep her. That truth had been with her since the beginning, but it felt heavier now that she loved the child without reservation. A knock broke the hush, sharper than she expected. She rose slowly, her heart thudding. When she opened the door, she found a man standing on the step, a dusting of snow clinging to the brim of his dark hat. He was not from town. She would have known his face if he were. His eyes were a shade too pale, and though his voice was quiet when he spoke, it carried the weight of certainty. "I believe you're caring for a child who doesn't belong to you," he said. Martha felt her spine stiffen. "I'm caring for a child who needed a home." He studied her, his gaze unflinching. "My name is Nathaniel Rowe. I've been searching for my daughter for months. She was taken from my family under circumstances I'd rather not recount on your porch." She stepped back, her hand tightening on the edge of the door. The world tilted a fraction as she tried to take in the words. "Your daughter? She was left in the river, someone meant for her to die." His mouth pressed into a line that looked almost like sorrow. "I know how it sounds. I didn't abandon her. My wife passed last year, and after her death, there were complications in the family. I'm only asking you to let me see her. Just to be sure." Martha's mind reeled. She glanced over her shoulder, where Elena sat blinking at the lamp's glow. For one instant, she wished she could slam the door, pretend this stranger had never arrived. But something in his facey a gentleness she couldn't dismiss kept her rooted. She stepped aside. "If you mean her no harm, you can come in." Nathaniel moved carefully into the cabin, removing his hat, as though entering sacred ground. He approached the blanket where Elena waited, her small body still and watchful. When he crouched and spoke her name, his voice trembled. "Maya," he whispered, reaching out with a hand that shook. The baby did not flinch. Instead, she gazed up at him with the same quiet curiosity she offered to Martha. In that moment, Martha felt her heart splinter into pieces she didn't know how to gather. She had expected anger, or relief, or some undeniable proof that this man was lying. Instead, she saw something she recognized too well, a grief so vast it had hollowed him out. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the pulse that reminded her she was still here, still breathing, still willing to fight for the child who had changed everything. Nathaniel looked up at her, his expression raw. "I don't want to cause you pain, but I need to know she's mine." Martha swallowed the ache in her throat. "We'll find a way to be sure, but until then, she stays with me." He nodded slowly, as if he had already guessed that would be her answer. In the hush that followed, the wind pressed against the window, and Martha knew the quiet life she had built was no longer hers alone. Whatever came next, she would not face it without a claim of her own. She would not give up this child to fate without first standing her ground. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Martha stood near the stove, feeling the heat against her back as she tried to steady her thoughts. Nathaniel remained crouched by the blanket, one hand resting lightly near Elena but not quite touching her, as if he was afraid that any contact might confirm too much or break some hidden thread of hope. The child watched him with solemn eyes, her small fingers curling against the fabric in a way that looked almost deliberate. Martha tried to imagine what she would have felt in his place, knowing your child was somewhere out there, lost to you, and then finding her here, in a stranger's house at the end of a dirt road. The idea made her chest ache with something that was not exactly sympathy, but not quite resentment either. She thought of all the nights she had held Elena close, believing she was the only person left in the world who cared whether the baby survived. It felt impossible to consider that someone else might have been searching all along. Nathaniel finally broke the silence. His voice was low, nearly swallowed by the ticking of the old clock on the shelf. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I wouldn't, either. But I can tell you this much. When my wife died, I lost the only person who ever understood what it meant to love without condition. Maya was all I had left of her. And when she disappeared," he trailed off, pressing a hand to his mouth as if to steady something he couldn't say out loud. Martha folded her arms across her chest. She wished she could summon the old barriers that had protected her heart for so many years. But looking at him, she saw too much of her own grief reflected back at her. She lowered her gaze, feeling the roughness of her sweater under her palms. "If you truly believe she's yours," she said finally, "then we'll do what needs to be done to prove it. But understand this, she's safe here. No matter what comes of all this, I won't let her be hurt." He looked up, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that surprised her. "That's all I could ever ask." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table while Elena napped on her blanket, the hush between them layered with things neither knew how to explain. Nathaniel spoke in slow, halting sentences, as though he feared that saying too much would make it harder to bear if the truth turned out to be otherwise. He told her about the estate outside Carson Ridge, where he had lived with his wife and infant daughter. About the legal disputes that erupted when his wife's family contested the will, arguing that he was unfit to raise a child alone. About the night when Maya disappeared from her crib, leaving nothing but a pale blue blanket folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. Martha listened without interrupting. She didn't know whether she believed every word, but she heard the rawness behind them. She had her own memories of loss, and she knew the way it could shape a person, carve out the soft places until you no longer recognized yourself. When he finished speaking, she found herself tracing the grain of the tabletop with her thumb, trying to imagine how she would have survived such a fracture. "We can speak with the sheriff tomorrow," she said, her voice quiet. "If what you say is true, there will be records that prove who you are." He nodded, his shoulders lowering as if he had been bracing for her refusal. "Thank you. I know this isn't easy." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." Elena stirred then, making a soft sound that broke the tension like a bell in the fog. Martha rose and lifted her from the blanket, settling her against her shoulder. The baby blinked sleepily, then looked across the room at Nathaniel, her small face calm and unreadable. He reached out a tentative hand, his fingertips brushing her sleeve. The moment was so fragile Martha felt she should turn away, but she couldn't. For an instant, She saw something she hadn't let herself imagine, that this child could belong to them both, not as a possession but as a bond neither had chosen yet could not deny. The thought left her unsteady. She cleared her throat. "I think you should go for tonight. Come back tomorrow and we'll go together to speak with Sheriff Alden." He hesitated, as if the idea of leaving was a weight he didn't know how to carry. But then he stood, replacing his hat on his head with hands that trembled faintly. "All right, I'll come at first light." She walked him to the door, the cold pressing in around them as she opened it. He paused on the threshold, glancing once more at Elena where she lay nestled in her arms. "Thank you," he said softly, and for a moment he looked like a man who had been wandering for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stop. When she closed the door behind him, the cabin seemed smaller than it had an hour before, the walls holding the echo of all that had been said. She sat down in the rocker and drew Elena close, feeling the baby's breath warm against her collar. Outside, the wind moved through the orchard, lifting the bare branches in a restless dance. She knew the days ahead would bring questions she could not answer and choices she did not want to make. But in that moment, with the child cradled against her heart, she let herself believe that love, however complicated, was still the one thing that could not be taken away. And as night settled over the valley, she closed her eyes and whispered a promise into the quiet, a vow she hoped she would have the strength to keep. Morning crept into the cabin with a hush that felt almost like an apology for all it was about to bring. Martha sat by the window, watching the first pale streaks of dawn break over the river. She hadn't slept more than an hour. Her mind had turned in slow, relentless circles, replaying every word Nathaniel had spoken, and every moment she'd spent with the child who had become the center of her life. Elena stirred in her basket, her small mouth opening in a sleepy yawn. Martha reached down to lift her, cradling her close as if that simple gesture might anchor them both. She kissed the baby's warm cheek, feeling the way her heartbeat steadied at the contact. It was a fragile comfort, but it was all she had. She moved through the cabin on instinct, warming milk and folding the quilt that had slipped to the floor. Every action seemed more deliberate than it had the day before, as though she was bracing herself for the moment when someone else might try to claim the right to decide what this child needed. The thought made her chest ache in a place she hadn't known was still tender. When a knock sounded at the door, she startled. For an instant, she considered pretending she hadn't heard it. But she knew that would change nothing. So she settled Elena in her arms and opened the door. Nathaniel stood on the porch, his hat in one hand, his eyes rimmed with the weariness of someone who hadn't rested any more than she had. He looked at the baby before he looked at her, and in that moment, she saw how afraid. He was afraid of hoping, afraid of being wrong. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice quiet. She stepped aside, feeling the cold draft swirl around her ankles as he entered. The cabin seemed smaller with him there, every shadow deeper, every sound magnified. He sat on the edge of the chair nearest the stove and folded his hands, as if he didn't trust them to stay still otherwise. "I've brought the papers I have," he said, pulling a slim envelope from his coat. "Birth certificate, a copy of my wife's will, some photographs. It's not proof in itself, but it's a start." Martha set Elena on a folded blanket and took the envelope with fingers that didn't feel entirely her own. She pulled out the documents one by one, her eyes moving over each page slowly. The names meant nothing to her, not really, but when she reached the photograph, she felt her breath catch. It was a woman she didn't recognize, smiling down at an infant wrapped in a pale blue blanket. The baby's face was rounder then, her hair softer, but there was something unmistakable in the tilt of her eyes and the solemn way she seemed to study the world even at a few months old. Martha looked up, feeling the weight of the photograph settle into her chest. "She looks like her," Nathaniel said hoarsely, "doesn't she?" Martha could only nod. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling in the grate. Elena made a soft sound, a protest at being left alone, and Martha picked her up again without thinking. The baby tucked her face into the hollow of her shoulder, sighing in a way that was both content and trusting. "I don't know how to do this," Martha confessed, her voice low. "I don't know how to be the person who decides what happens next." "You don't have to decide alone," Nathaniel said. His gaze was steady, though she could see the fear in it. "I don't want to take her away from the only home she's known. But I need her to know where she came from." Martha studied him, searching for any sign that he was lying or trying to soften her resistance with practiced kindness. But all she saw was a man undone by grief and tethered to hope by the thinnest thread. She thought of the nights she had rocked Elena to sleep, whispering that she would never be abandoned again. The promise felt more complicated now, but it was still a promise. "If the sheriff can confirm what you've brought," she said carefully, "then I think we can find a way for you to be part of her life." His shoulders dropped, just slightly. "Thank you. That's more than I expected. I'm not agreeing to anything beyond that," she added quickly. "I don't know what's right yet. I understand." They fell quiet again. Martha watched the baby's small hand resting against her chest and felt a bittersweet ache. This child had already lost so much before she ever had a chance to understand what it meant. Martha didn't want her to lose more, not stability, not love, not the sense of belonging she had begun to build here. When the knock came again, it was softer. She knew before she opened the door that it would be Sheriff Alden. His gaze moved from Nathaniel to her to the baby. He tipped his hat in greeting and stepped inside without being asked. "I take it you're Mr. Rowe," he said, nodding to Nathaniel. "I am. And you've brought documentation?" Nathaniel handed over the envelope. The sheriff sat down at the table and began to sort through each piece, his expression patient but meticulous. The room grew very still, every crackle of the stove magnified. When he finished reading, he set the papers down and folded his hands. "It's a compelling story, Mr. Rowe, but you know as well as I do that the county will have to conduct an inquiry. Until that's resolved, this child remains in Martha's care." Nathaniel nodded. "I'm not here to disrupt her life. I just need to know she's all right." The sheriff looked at Martha. "Is that acceptable to you?" She swallowed the knot in her throat. "Yes. All right then, I'll file the report and keep you both informed. In the meantime—" He hesitated, then his voice softened. "This little girl has been through enough upheaval. Whatever happens next, she deserves patience." Martha looked down at Elena's face, so peaceful against her shoulder. She thought of all the times she'd tried to protect her from the world's cruelties, only to find that some truths could not be kept away. She met the sheriff's gaze and nodded, feeling something unspoken pass between theme and understanding, that this was no longer just about rules or claims, but about the shape of a child's future. After the sheriff left, Nathaniel stood to go as well. He paused near the door, one hand resting against the frame. "Thank you for listening, for not shutting me out." "I don't know how this will end," Martha said quietly. "Neither do I. But maybe we can try to do right by her, together." When he was gone, Martha turned back to the warmth of the cabin and held Elena close. The baby shifted, her eyes opening just enough to find her face. For an instant, Martha felt almost certain that no matter what claims the world might make, no one could erase the bond that had formed between them in the quiet hours of the storm. And as the shadows lengthened across the floor, she promised herself she would hold to that truth, whatever came next. The following days unfolded with a tense quiet that made each hour feel longer than the last. Martha moved through her small routines, as if any sudden motion might shatter the fragile truce that had taken hold. She fed Elena, washed the bottles, folded the same soft quilt over and over again. Yet behind every small act was the knowledge that her life would not remain untouched much longer. Each morning, she looked out the window, half expecting Nathaniel to appear at the edge of the path, carrying more papers or questions she wasn't ready to face, but he didn't come. She tried not to wonder where he spent those hours, or whether he was as restless as she was. When she lay awake at night, she found herself thinking of the expression on his face when he'd first spoken the child's name. It was a look she hadn't seen in years, a kind of raw yearning that left no room for pride. One afternoon, when the sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in days, Martha bundled Elena in her thickest blanket and carried her outside. She couldn't bear the stale air any longer. The river moved quietly under the crust of ice, as if even it had grown weary of all the waiting. She walked to the fence at the edge of her property, resting her arms on the rail while the baby dozed against her chest. The orchard looked lifeless in the thin light. The bare trees stood like silent witnesses to everything she couldn't say aloud. She thought of all the seasons she'd spent here, years of planting and pruning, of losing more than she ever expected. And now, somehow, she was being asked to open her heart again, to risk the only bit of purpose she'd found since Robert's death. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until they were close. When she turned, she saw Nathaniel standing just beyond the gate, his hands in his pockets. His gaze was cautious, as if he feared she might send him away before he could speak. "I didn't want to intrude," he said quietly, "but I've been staying at the inn in town. I thought you should know." Martha adjusted her hold on Elena and nodded. She wasn't sure what to say. "I understand why you don't trust me," he continued, stepping closer. "But I've spoken to the sheriff. They'll start the inquiry next week. I'll cooperate with whatever they ask." Her throat felt tight. "And if they decide she belongs with you?" He looked at the baby then, his face shadowed with something she couldn't name. "Then I suppose I'll have to find a way to bring her home without breaking her heart or yours." Martha didn't look away. In that moment, she saw past the polished shoes and the careful manners to the sorrow beneath it all. He was a man who had been hollowed out by loss, the same as she had been. Only now there was something in him trying to take root again, something as unsure as it was determined. Elena stirred, her small hand working free of the blanket. Without thinking, Martha reached out and brushed a thumb across the baby's cheek, feeling the warmth there. When she looked back at Nathaniel, her voice was steadier than she expected. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I've never had to share her with anyone." His expression softened. "Maybe neither of us has to pretend we know what we're doing. Maybe it's enough to care about the same child." They stood in silence while the wind rustled the brittle weeds along the fence. The afternoon light caught the edge of the river, sending a weak shimmer across the ice. It made her think of the night she'd found Elena, of how impossible it had seemed that anything so small could have survived. And yet here she was, asleep and breathing and wholly unaware that her life was being decided in careful conversations between strangers. Martha shifted her weight, feeling the ache in her back from standing so long. She wanted to retreat to the safety of her kitchen, to the rituals that felt like certainty. But she also knew she could not pretend this man would simply vanish. "If you'd like," she said slowly, "you can come back tomorrow. You could sit with her a while." His eyes lifted to meet hers, surprise flickering there. "You'd allow that?" She nodded, though her heart stumbled at the thought. "I don't know what's right, but it seems wrong to keep her from you altogether." "Thank you," he said softly. "I promise, I'm not here to take her away in the dark." "I know," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. As he turned to leave, she watched him go with a heaviness she hadn't prepared for. Part of her had hoped she would feel lighter after speaking to him. Instead, she felt more entangled, as if every step forward bound her to a future she could neither predict nor escape. When she carried Elena back into the cabin, she moved with extra care, laying her gently in the basket by the stove. The child slept on, undisturbed by all the uncertainty swirling around her. Martha rested her palm against the baby's chest, feeling the small heartbeat under her skin. And in that quiet, she realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. The love she felt for this child was no longer something she could separate from her own survival. Whatever came next, she would face it. But she would not pretend that letting go would be simple or clean. As dusk settled over the fields, she lit the lamp and sat beside the basket, her hand never leaving Elena's blanket. She closed her eyes and told herself that no matter how complicated love could be, it was still the only thing worth trusting in the end. The next morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of winter day that felt honest in its coldness. Martha stood at the sink, rinsing the bottle she'd just used to feed Elena. Steam curled up around her fingers, and she watched it dissolve into the air with the quiet awareness that before long, nothing about her life would look the same. The thought left her more tired than afraid. She turned to find Elena propped in the basket by the stove, her small hands waving with restless curiosity. The baby's eyes followed every movement Martha made, tracking her with a focus that seemed far older than her few months of life. Martha wiped her hands on a cloth and bent to lift her. As she settled the child against her shoulder, she wondered if Elena would one day remember any of this, these mornings spent in the hush of a house that was learning, hour by hour, to feel like a home again. When a knock sounded at the door, she felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't forgotten her promise to Nathaniel. She had spent the night reminding herself that letting him in did not mean surrendering all claim to the child she'd carried out of the river. Still, as she crossed the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that every decision she made now would be weighed and remembered. Nathaniel stood on the porch, a paper-wrapped parcel tucked under his arm. He looked different in the bright daylight, less like a stranger, and more like a man who had been hollowed out by the same kind of loss she knew too well. "Good morning," he said, his voice careful. "I thought I'd bring something." It was hers, when she was very small. She stepped aside, motioning him in without a word. He moved past her, glancing around the room as though trying to understand what this space had become. Martha set Elena back in her basket, feeling the baby's fingers brush her wrist in a fleeting touch she didn't want to give up. Nathaniel approached the stove and unfolded the parcel on the table. Inside was a knitted blanket the color of pale honey. The yarn looked worn but cared for, the edges scalloped by hand. He lifted it with a gentleness that caught Martha by surprise. "My wife made this while she was expecting," he said. "She spent weeks choosing the pattern. I thought if it wouldn't trouble you, you might let her have it here." Martha studied the blanket, her throat tight. It was a small thing, really. But she understood how such an offering could feel like a surrender of something precious. She nodded once, then reached to take it from his hands. "Thank you," she said softly. They sat together in the kitchen, the fire murmuring behind them. Nathaniel folded his hands on the table, his gaze drifting toward the baby as if she might vanish if he looked away. "I don't expect you to decide anything today," he said after a time. "I know it will take more than paperwork to prove who I am." Martha watched Elena twist her head to follow the sound of his voice. "I don't doubt you care for her," she admitted. "But caring isn't the same as knowing how to be here." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They fell quiet again. The hush between them felt less like a barrier, and more like a space that needed filling with something neither of them quite knew how to give. At length, Martha rose and lifted Elena from the basket. She crossed the room and settled the baby carefully into Nathaniel's arms. The motion was deliberate, a gesture that cost her more than she expected. His breath caught as he looked down at the small face turned up to his. For a moment, the lines of grief smoothed from his features. "Hello," he whispered, his voice rough. "You don't remember me, do you?" The baby reached up, her fingers brushing the lapel of his coat as if testing whether he was real. He closed his eyes, and Martha turned away, unable to watch the fragile hope in his face without feeling as though she'd been split in two. When she finally looked back, he was studying her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me hold her," he said quietly. "It's not trust, exactly," she murmured. "It's something I don't have a name for yet." That seemed to satisfy him, because he only nodded. He stayed until the fire burned down to embers, and the shadows grew long across the floor. They spoke little, but the silence between them felt different by the time he finally stood to leave, less weighted, somehow, more honest. As he walked to the door, he turned and searched her face. "I don't want this to be a fight, Martha. I don't think she'd survive that." She swallowed, feeling the baby's absence as keenly as an ache. "Neither would I," she said. He held her gaze a moment longer, then slipped out into the waning light. Martha closed the door and leaned her back against it, her hands pressed flat to the wood. She took a slow breath and tried to quiet the tremor in her chest. When she bent to lift Elena again, she felt the softness of the honey-colored blanket still warm where it had been folded. She draped it over the baby and pressed her cheek to the delicate knit, letting the scent of old wool and something she couldn't name settle into her lungs. For the first time since the river had carried Elena to her, Martha understood that loving this child would never be a simple thing. It would always mean letting go of something: fear, certainty, the belief that she alone could define what was right. And though she couldn't have said why, she felt certain that learning to let go, even a little, might be the only way to keep the promise she had made the night she pulled the baby from the dark. Winter pressed closer as the days shortened, each morning slower to brighten the frost-glazed windows. Martha woke before dawn, listening to the hush that always settled over the cabin just before the stove crackled to life. She lay still for a moment, trying to measure the shape of the ache in her chest. It wasn't fear exactly, though fear was part of it. It was something deeper, a recognition that life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Elena had begun to stir earlier each morning, her small sounds growing more insistent as though she sensed that something hovered in the air between the adults who hovered near her. When Martha lifted her, she felt the comforting weight of the baby's head against her collarbone. She held her longer than she needed to, breathing in the warm, milky scent of her skin. After she settled the baby with her bottle, Martha moved through her chores in a measured rhythm. Each task was slower than usual, as if she were trying to imprint this version of her life in her memory before it dissolved into something new. She scrubbed the kettle until it gleamed, folded the dish towels into perfect squares, lined up the jars in the pantry so each label faced front. By the time she heard the knock on the door, the sky had softened into a pale wash of blue. She set down the cloth in her hands and brushed her palms over her skirt, feeling the small flutter in her stomach. She opened the door to find Nathaniel standing there, his hat held in both hands, the collar of his coat pulled high against the cold. "Good morning," he said, his voice more tentative than she'd ever heard it. "Come in," Martha replied, stepping aside. "It's colder today." He nodded, though he didn't move at once. Instead, his gaze drifted past her to where Elena sat in the basket, blinking at the weak daylight. When he did step inside, he seemed careful not to disrupt anything, as if he knew the balance between them was still too new to bear sudden shifts. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the fire just beginning to warm the room. Nathaniel set a small leather-bound album on the table between them. "I thought you might like to see these," he said. Pictures of her mother. Martha hesitated before she reached for the album. She opened it slowly, the leather creaking in her hands. The first photograph was of a woman standing in a garden, her hands resting on the swell of her belly. She was smiling, her head tilted slightly, the light catching her hair so it looked almost silver. There was something unguarded in her face, a softness that made Martha's throat ache. "She was beautiful," Martha said quietly. "She was," he agreed, his voice catching. "She was better than I deserved." Martha turned the pages one by one. Each image showed the woman sometimes alone, sometimes with Nathaniel, always with that same open expression, as though she'd never learned to be afraid of loving something too much. When she reached the final page, she paused. It was a picture of the woman holding a newborn wrapped in a knitted blanket the color of honey. The baby's face was turned toward the camera, her tiny features unmistakable. Martha felt her hand tremble where it rested on the page. "You don't have to say anything," Nathaniel said softly. "I know this is complicated." Martha closed the album, pressing her palm flat against the worn cover. She looked across the table at him, feeling the distance between them shrink just a little. "She's a piece of her," Martha murmured, "a part of her you still have." He nodded, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire popped softly behind them, the only sound in the hush that had settled over the room. After a long while, Martha rose and crossed to the basket. She lifted Elena and carried her back to the table. Without quite knowing why, she offered her to Nathaniel. He took the baby into his arms as though she were made of something rarer than glass. "Hello," he whispered, brushing a thumb along her cheek. His eyes shone with something Martha had no name for: hope, maybe, or the first fragile stirring of forgiveness. The baby studied his face with her solemn gaze. One tiny hand lifted to clutch the edge of his shirt, and Martha felt something inside her ease. She sat back down, folding her hands to still their trembling. "I don't know how this will work," she said finally. "I don't know if there's a right way to do any of it." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I want her to know where she came from, and I don't want to take her from the only person who's ever kept her safe." Martha felt a rush of relief so sudden it left her dizzy. For the first time since he had appeared on her porch, she believed him completely. "We'll figure it out," she said, "together." Nathaniel looked up, meeting her gaze with something close to gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured. Outside the window, the wind tugged at the bare branches along the riverbank. Martha felt the familiar ache in her chest, but it was softer now, edged with something she hadn't let herself hope for. As the morning light grew stronger, she watched the man and the child in front of her, and let herself believe that maybe love didn't have to be claimed all at once. Maybe it could be built, day by day, with the same patient care she'd once given her orchard. And in that small, bright moment, she felt the first true certainty she'd known in years, that whatever they were creating here was worth the risk it asked of them all. Snow fell all through the night, so thick and steady that by morning the yard was covered in an unbroken sheet of white. Martha stood at the window, one hand resting lightly on the glass, watching the pale drift swirl across the fence posts. It looked peaceful, almost clean, as though the world had been scrubbed of every harsh thing that had come before. But she knew better. Outside might be blank and quiet, but inside, her thoughts moved in restless circles she couldn't still. Behind her, Nathaniel sat in the rocker, cradling Elena with a kind of careful awe that hadn't faded since the day she'd first placed the child in his arms. The baby was making soft cooing sounds, her tiny hands patting the front of his coat as if to test whether he would remain real if she touched him enough times. Every now and then, he would smile and murmur something she couldn't hear, and Martha felt the fragile hope of it settle somewhere deep in her ribs. She turned to stoke the fire, adding another log to the embers. The warmth rose in a bright rush that did nothing to quiet the tremor in her hands. She couldn't remember the last time she'd shared her home with anyone for more than an hour or two, let alone a man she barely knew. Yet somehow, Nathaniel had slipped into the space between her solitude and her devotion, and she hadn't found the strength to shut him out. When she finally turned back, she found him watching her over the top of Elena's head. His expression was neither expectant nor apologetic, just open, and tired, and terribly human. "You must think I'm intruding," he said quietly. She shook her head, though she wasn't sure she meant no as much as not yet. "You're here for her," she said. "That doesn't feel like an intrusion." He glanced down at the child in his arms, a small crease between his brows. "I keep thinking she'll look at me and remember something. That she'll know who I am." "Maybe she does," Martha said, "but she's too little to say it." He smiled, though it was the kind that never reached the eyes. "I used to think there would be time. That when my wife was gone, at least I'd have years with my daughter to make sense of it all." He paused, drawing in a careful breath. "Now I'm afraid all I have left is this, trying to prove to strangers that I'm telling the truth." Martha crossed the room and lowered herself into the chair opposite him. Her knees ached in the cold, but she didn't let herself show it. She folded her hands in her lap and studied his face. "I don't think you're lying," she said softly. "I think you're holding on to something because letting go would be worse than any shame or grief." His gaze lifted, startled by her honesty, and maybe by her understanding. "I don't know what to call this," she continued. "We're two people who want the same child, but for reasons that don't match. I can't pretend that doesn't scare me." "It scares me too," he admitted. Elena shifted, her cheek settling against his shoulder with a contented sigh. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Martha thought about all the ways she'd tried to protect herself from needing anyone. How she'd convinced herself that love was an indulgence she couldn't afford, not when loss always waited on the other side of it. But looking at the child cradled so gently in Nathaniel's arms, she realized how foolish that had been. Love was always an opening, and always a risk, but maybe that was what gave it value. The sheriff came just after midday, his boots leaving a trail of snow across the porch. He stepped inside and took off his hat, shaking it free of the cold. His face was lined with weariness, but there was something like relief in his eyes. "I've spoken with the county," he said without preamble. "They'll be sending someone out to start the inquiry in person next week. Papers will be reviewed. Witnesses interviewed." He paused, glancing between them. "And they'll likely want a DNA test." Martha nodded slowly, feeling her heart knock hard against her ribs. "And if it proves what he says, then the decision will fall to the court," the sheriff said. "But I'll tell you this," he looked at Nathaniel, "what you've brought me so far is more than most people would bother to collect. And you seem determined to do this the right way." "I am," Nathaniel said, his voice low. The sheriff looked back to Martha, his expression softening. "Until they finish their process, Elena stays here. You've kept her safe, and nobody can say otherwise." "Thank you," Martha murmured. After the sheriff left, the cabin felt impossibly quiet. Nathaniel stood, still cradling the child, and crossed to where Martha sat. Without asking, he lowered himself into the other chair again, as if some invisible agreement had been made that they would not retreat to their separate corners just yet. "She doesn't know any of this," he said after a while, his gaze fixed on Elena's small, sleeping face. "She doesn't know she's the reason two strangers are trying to build a bridge over a river neither of them wanted to cross." Martha swallowed, feeling the ache in her throat. No, she agreed. She just knows she's warm, and fed, and loved. His eyes lifted to hers, and maybe that's enough for now. Maybe, she whispered. As the afternoon wore on, they sat together without speaking, the fire soft in the grate and the snow falling steadily beyond the window. It was the strangest kind of peace, shaky and unfinished, yet no less real for its imperfection. And for the first time, Martha allowed herself to consider that whatever the inquiry decided, there might be room for something more generous than winning or losing. There might be a way to honor the love each of them carried without destroying what they had tried to protect. The days that followed moved in a strange, unhurried procession, as if time itself were reluctant to force any final reckoning. Snow continued to fall, layering the yard in a quiet that made every footstep feel amplified. Inside the cabin, life settled into an uneasy rhythm, each morning beginning with the same hush that held 100 questions no one dared to voice. Martha woke before dawn each day, her body already braced for the decisions that would come. She'd grown accustomed to the soft creak of the rocker as Nathaniel held Elena in the evenings, and the gentle way he always returned the child to her arms when it was time to go. There was no map for what they were doing, only a shared determination not to let the child feel the fracture that lay between them. One morning, as she folded the baby's clean clothes into the basket by the stove, Martha heard footsteps crunching across the frozen yard. She glanced through the window, expecting Nathaniel's familiar silhouette, but it was Sheriff Alden who appeared at the door, his breath fogging in the cold. She opened the door before he could knock, her heart giving a small, tired lurch. "Morning, Sheriff," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He removed his hat and stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots. "Morning. I won't keep you long." He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting Nathaniel to emerge from some hidden corner. "Is Mr. Rowe here?" "Not yet." He nodded and shifted his weight. "The county representative will be arriving tomorrow. I wanted you to hear it from me first." Martha felt her stomach tighten. "And then what?" "There'll be an interview. They'll want to see the child, review the records." He looked at her kindly. "But no one's going to take her out of your arms on the spot." She closed her eyes, relief mingling with dread. "Thank you." He hesitated, his hat twisting in his hands. "I've known you a long time, Martha. If you want me here when they come, just say the word." She opened her mouth to decline out of habit, but something in his quiet sincerity stopped her. "I would appreciate that," she whispered. He tipped his head, then slipped out into the cold. She closed the door behind him and leaned her forehead against the wood, the old knots pressing into her skin. It wasn't long before Nathaniel arrived, carrying a small bag of groceries from the store in town. He paused when he saw her standing there, his expression alert. "Is everything all right?" She turned, studying the lines of fatigue etched around his mouth. "They're coming tomorrow. The county." He exhaled, as if he'd been holding that breath for days. "All right." That was all they said about it. No speculation, no rehearsed arguments. Just those two words that carried the weight of everything they hadn't yet resolved. He set the groceries on the counter and unwrapped a loaf of bread, a slab of cheese, a tin of jam. It was more food than she usually kept in the house, and for a moment, she felt the absurd impulse to laugh. He was trying to make the cabin feel like something it wasn't, some ordinary place where people gathered without consequence. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. It felt like something to do, he admitted, almost embarrassed. They shared a quiet meal at the table, Elena dozing in the crook of Martha's elbow. Every now and then, Nathaniel's gaze would drift to the child's face, and something in him would soften in a way that made her throat ache. When she finished her tea, she set down her cup and met his eyes across the table. "Do you know what you'll say to them?" "I'll tell them the truth," he replied. "That I failed her once when I couldn't keep her safe. That I'm not here to make that mistake again." Martha looked down at Elena's small hand curled against her sleeve. "And if they give you custody?" His mouth tightened. "Then I hope you'll stay in her life. She's known you longer than she's known anyone." She hadn't expected him to say that, and for a moment, she couldn't answer. The idea that he would willingly share this child with earthly stranger who had found his daughter in the river was almost too much to believe. "You'd allow that?" she asked quietly. "More than allow it. I think she'd need it." The hush that settled over them felt less heavy this time, as if the shape of it were starting to change. She thought of all the nights she'd spent believing she was the only person who could love this child enough to keep her safe. And she wondered if love might be larger than that, something wide enough to contain both of them. Nathaniel rose and took Elena gently from her arms. He held the baby close, brushing a thumb along her cheek. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," he murmured. "But I think she deserves to know we tried to do it kindly." Martha felt her eyes sting, though she didn't let the tears fall. "You're right," she said, her voice unsteady. He turned toward the window, where the sky had turned the color of pewter. Snow was still falling in thin, determined strands. For a long time, he stood there with the child in his arms, and she let the moment stretch as far as it needed to go. Later, when he left, Martha closed the door behind him with a strange, fragile calm. She understood that nothing they said or did would erase the uncertainty waiting on the far side of tomorrow. But she also knew, with a certainty she hadn't possessed before, that no one would ever again be able to tell her she wasn't part of this child's story. And in the hush that followed his leaving, she folded the small honey-colored blanket over the rocker and whispered a single promise she could not yet explain. "Whatever happens, you will not walk into your future unloved." Morning arrived gray and solemn, the snow still falling in a hush that muffled every sound. Martha stood in the doorway, holding Elena close, and watched the county vehicle crawl up the lane. Its tires cut deep tracks through the drifts, reminding her of how easily the world outside could carve itself into the life she'd built. She drew the baby against her shoulder and pressed her lips to the warm crown of her head. Elena didn't fuss. She never did in the early hours, as though she understood the need for quiet before the day began demanding things neither of them could refuse. When the car stopped near the fence, she felt her heartbeat grow heavy. A woman stepped out first, her dark coat buttoned to the chin, a folder clutched under one arm. She was not unkind in the way she carried herself, but there was a brisk certainty in her movements that made Martha brace for whatever came next. Nathaniel appeared beside the car, having walked from the inn. His shoulders were squared, his mouth a careful line, but when he lifted his eyes to meet Martha's, she saw the same raw fear she felt in her own chest. Sheriff Alden pulled up moments later. He got out slowly, as though determined not to let the cold turn this into a spectacle. His familiar presence steadied her more than she would have thought possible. He nodded once, then followed the woman up the steps. Martha stepped back to let them enter. The official introduced herself Miss Hayworth, Child Welfare, and began speaking in a measured tone about procedure, documentation, the need to confirm identities. Martha listened, holding Elena tight against her chest, willing the baby's small heartbeat to keep her grounded. Miss Hayworth asked questions, her pen scratching across the forms she balanced on her knee. "When did you find the child? What condition was she in? Why didn't you contact authorities immediately?" Each inquiry felt like a quiet rebuke, though the woman's voice remained polite. Martha answered as steadily as she could. She told the truth, plain and unadorned, though every word cost her something she couldn't name. She explained how she'd believed no one would come, how she'd looked into the baby's eyes that first night and known she couldn't send her into the care of strangers. At last, Miss Hayworth closed her folder and turned to Nathaniel. He had not sat down, but stood by the stove with his hands braced against the edge of the table. His gaze never left Elena, even when he spoke. "My wife passed last year," he said quietly. "After that, my daughter disappeared. I don't have every answer you're looking for, but I have never stopped searching." There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, only a weariness that made Martha feel her heart contract. The official asked for the documents he'd brought: birth certificates, photographs, court filings, and he handed them over without hesitation. When she looked up again, her expression was softer. "We will verify all of this, but regardless of what we find, I see no reason to remove the child from this home immediately." She turned to Martha. "You have provided her care. That matters." Martha closed her eyes for a moment. The air in the cabin felt thin, but she could breathe. That small reprieve was more than she'd hoped for. "Thank you," she whispered. Miss Hayworth nodded. "The court will expect both of you to appear when the investigation concludes. That could be several weeks. In the meantime, We'll schedule supervised visits so you both remain in her life." Nathaniel finally sank into the chair nearest him, his hands falling to his lap. His relief was so palpable it felt almost intrusive to witness. Martha shifted Elena higher on her shoulder, pressing her cheek to the child's hair. When the official and sheriff left, the quiet they left behind was not the same as before. It was fuller, layered with something like understanding. Martha set Elena in her basket, her hands brushing the small honey-colored blanket as she tucked it around her. Nathaniel rose and moved to stand across from her. His face was tired, but there was something steadier in it than she had seen yet. "I don't know what happens next," he said, his voice low. "But I want you to know I'm grateful for what you've done. Even if the court decides she should come with me, I hope you'll stay in her life." Martha studied him, feeling the weight of all that had passed between them in these strange, suspended weeks. There had been a time she would have bristled at the idea of sharing any part of herself. But that time felt far away now. "I don't know if I can be anything but her home," she admitted. "But I won't vanish from her life if you don't want me to." His throat worked, and he looked away, as if the rawness of that promise was almost too much to hold. She reached out then, surprising herself. She laid her hand on his sleeve, feeling the faint tremor beneath the fabric. It wasn't forgiveness she was offering. It wasn't surrender. It was something simpler, acknowledgement that neither of them had chosen this, but both of them had chosen her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cabin seemed to exhale around them, the quiet becoming something almost gentle. When he finally left, Martha stood at the door and watched him walk down the snowy path. She felt tired clear through to her bones, but there was a clarity inside her she hadn't known she was searching for. She turned back to Elena, who was awake now, her eyes bright in the soft afternoon light. Martha lifted her, pressing her lips to the child's temple, and let her heart settle into the simple, aching certainty of the moment. Whatever the court decided, whatever names were written on the final papers, she knew what she had been to this child, and no one could take that truth away. The days that followed felt like the slow unraveling of a thread Martha hadn't realized she'd been clutching for months. Each morning brought the same hush that settled over the cabin, after the county visit, a hush that felt neither hostile nor kind, just watchful. She found herself listening to the smallest sounds, the creak of the rocker as she soothed Elena to sleep, the sigh of wind moving through the eaves, the faint echo of her own heartbeat in the early hours before dawn. It was remarkable, she thought, how quickly life could shift into a new shape. Nathaniel came most afternoons now, walking the half-mile from the inn even when the snow lay deep across the path. He would knock softly, as if he feared startling them both, and she would open the door with the same quiet acceptance she'd surprised herself by feeling. He never stayed more than an hour, but in that time, he seemed to memorize every detail of his daughter's face, the way her small mouth puckered in sleep, the way her hands batted at the edge of her blanket when she woke. Sometimes Martha sat across from him at the table, her hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, and wondered what it must be like to carry hope and grief so close together they were nearly indistinguishable. Other times, she watched him from the rocker, letting the stillness between them stretch until it felt almost comfortable. One afternoon, as the wind rattled the shutters, Nathaniel lifted Elena from her basket with a care that bordered on reverence. She didn't cry. She never did when he was near. Instead, she watched him with the same solemn curiosity that had captivated Martha from the start. He brushed a thumb across her cheek and spoke in a voice so soft she had to lean forward to hear. "You look so much like her mother," he murmured, his eyes bright in the low light. "I hope you'll forgive me for not being there when you needed me most." Martha felt something tighten in her chest. She looked away, pretending to adjust the log in the stove, but the words hung in the air between them, too honest to ignore. It was easier, somehow, to pretend she hadn't heard the raw edge of regret in his voice. When she turned back, she saw he was watching her. There was no accusation in his expression, only the same fragile gratitude she'd seen the day the county official had come. For the first time, she thought she understood the courage it took to admit that you couldn't undo what had been lost. "You're here now," she said quietly. "That matters more than you think." He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. But he didn't argue. Instead, he shifted Elena to the crook of his arm and turned so the baby could see the snow blowing in soft spirals past the window. Together they watched the world beyond the glass, and Martha felt a hush settle over her heart that had nothing to do with resignation. That evening, after he had gone, she lingered by the window longer than usual. She watched his figure recede down the path, the dusk swallowing him one slow step at a time. The wind pressed against the panes in steady gusts, but inside, the cabin felt warm and almost forgiving. When she turned back to Elena, she found the baby awake and studying her with wide, solemn eyes. Martha crossed the room and lifted her, feeling the small, reassuring weight settle against her shoulder. She closed her eyes, letting the child's soft breath warm the hollow beneath her collarbone. It struck her then how many versions of herself she had inhabited in the months since the storm. The woman who had opened the door that night had been lonely, yes, but also convinced she had nothing left to offer anyone. The woman she had become now was no less afraid, but she was no longer alone in her fear. And that, she realized, was its own kind of grace. She sat down in the rocker, gathering Elena close. The baby's head tucked under her chin, warm and impossibly trusting. Martha rested her cheek against the fine down of her hair and let the quiet deepen. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it might mean if the court ruled in Nathaniel's favor. She pictured the empty basket, the silence that would fill the hours once Elena was gone. The thought brought a slow ache that pressed tears into her eyes. But when she looked past that ache, she saw something else, an image she hadn't dared entertain before. Nathaniel standing in her doorway, months or years from now, Elena a little older, her hand in his, both of them crossing the threshold with the easy familiarity of people who knew they were always welcome. The vision surprised her with its tenderness. It didn't erase the fear, but it offered a shape for her hope to inhabit. Maybe there was no perfect way to share the child they both loved. But perhaps there was a good way, a kind way. A way that left no one feeling as though they had been robbed of something essential. She rocked slowly, her palm resting on the curve of Elena's back. Outside, the wind sang in low, unbroken notes. She thought of the orchard in the spring, how it would stand in pale bloom no matter who came or went from this cabin. And she told herself, as the last light of day slid behind the ridge, that whatever came next, she would find her way to it without bitterness. Because love, she was learning, was not a single act or a single choice. It was a decision made again and again. In every small moment when you resolved to keep your heart open, no matter how much it hurt. The week that followed passed in a quiet that felt more deliberate than before. It wasn't the hush of dread anymore, but something closer to preparation, a kind of measured calm that Martha suspected was the only thing keeping her from unraveling. She woke each morning with a sense that her life was poised on the edge of a change she couldn't postpone, no matter how much she might wish to. Nathaniel came as often as he could. Some days, when the roads were clear enough, he stayed long into the afternoon. Other times he arrived just before dusk, his boots carrying a crust of snow that melted onto the floorboards. Each time he crossed the threshold, Martha felt her heart tighten in that strange, contradictory way she was coming to accept, part reluctance, part relief. On a bright morning when the sky was scraped clean of clouds, she found him standing in the yard before she'd even stepped onto the porch. He looked younger in the hard winter light, though the strain around his eyes hadn't eased. He carried no folder or papers, that day only a small cloth bag clutched in one hand. "I thought she might like this," he said when she opened the door. He unknotted the drawstring and held it out. Inside was a wooden rattle, polished smooth by years of handling. It was a simple thing, but Martha could see it had been treasured. The curve of it fit his palm as though it had been carved for him alone. "It was mine, when I was small," he explained, not meeting her gaze. "My mother kept it all this time. I thought." He trailed off, searching for words that didn't come. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. She gestured for him to step inside. They sat together by the stove while Elena dozed in her basket. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was a strange intimacy in that quiet, as if the cabin itself understood that all the easy words had already been spent. After a time, Martha reached out and took the rattle from where he'd set it on the table. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the grooves worn smooth by decades. When she looked up, she found him watching her with a question in his eyes he hadn't dared ask aloud. "You don't have to thank me," she said gently. "You're her father. This belongs with her." He exhaled in a way that sounded almost like relief. "I wasn't sure you'd see it that way." "I didn't, not at first," she admitted. But things looked different now. She set the rattle beside the folded blanket in the basket. Elena stirred and blinked up at them, her expression calm, untroubled by the quiet struggle that had shaped every day of her short life. Nathaniel reached to lift her, but hesitated. "Go on," Martha said. He gathered the child in his arms, cradling her with a practiced tenderness that surprised her. She watched him sway slightly, his voice low as he spoke to the baby about nothing in particular, just a string of words that seemed meant more for himself than for her. She felt her heart soften in spite of itself. When he finally looked up, there was something resolute in his face that she hadn't seen before. "I keep thinking there should be a way to do this without hurting her," he said. "But I don't know if such a way exists." Martha folded her hands in her lap. She felt the same uncertainty press against her chest, familiar and heavy. "If you'd asked me months ago whether I could share her with anyone, I'd have said no," she confessed. "But now—" She paused, searching for words she'd never had to assemble before. "Now I think it would be worse if she had to choose between us." He met her eyes, his expression unguarded. "So what do we do?" "We wait," she said softly. "And while we wait, we keep showing up. She needs to see that neither of us is going to disappear." His shoulders eased, as though he'd been carrying that question in secret. "I can do that." "Good," she murmured, "because I can too." The afternoon passed in a quiet she no longer minded. She busied herself with small chores while he rocked Elena by the window, the child's head nestled in the hollow of his shoulder. Every so often, he would look over as if to reassure himself that she was still there, and she would nod, a silent acknowledgement that they were both learning how to be more generous than they had known they could be. As the light began to fade, he prepared to leave. He paused in the doorway, Elena drowsing in the crook of his arm. His gaze roamed the little room, the stove, the rocker, the low shelf of jars before, returning to her face. "This place feels like it belongs to her," he said quietly. "It does," Martha agreed, "but it belongs to you too if you want it to." He didn't reply at first, but she saw the way his throat worked as he swallowed whatever emotion rose there. "Thank you," he said finally. When he was gone, she sat in the rocker and let the hush of evening gather around her. She closed her eyes and laid her palm over her heart, feeling the uneven rhythm there. It wasn't peace she felt exactly, but it was something close in understanding that whatever verdict the court delivered, the love they'd all built together could not be unmade by any official decree. In the end, she thought, it was not a question of ownership, but of presence, who stayed, who showed up when it would have been easier to turn away. And as she rocked in the slow darkness, she knew she was no longer afraid of what tomorrow would ask of her, because she had already chosen to remain, no matter how much it hurt to do so. Hi chat VPT. The morning of the hearing dawned bitterly cold. Frost had crept along the inside corners of the window panes, drawing pale filigree patterns Martha traced absently with her thumb as she waited for the kettle to boil. The quiet in the cabin felt different that day, thicker, almost expectant, as if the walls themselves were aware that nothing would be the same by evening. Elena was still asleep in her basket, one small hand curled against her cheek. Martha watched the slow rise and fall of her breath, trying to memorize the way her face looked in that unguarded peace. No part of her had ever imagined that loving a child she'd found by chance would carry her into a courtroom, but she didn't regret a single moment of the winding road that had brought her here. When Nathaniel knocked at the door, she already knew it was him. She opened it to find him braced against the cold, his shoulders squared with a determination that made something in her loosen. He didn't speak right away. His gaze swept over her face, searching for something neither of them had a name for, and then drifted past her to the baby still nestled in sleep. "Are you ready?" he asked finally, his voice lower than usual. "No," she admitted, "but I'm going anyway." A smile flickered at the edge of his mouth, brief and sad. "I don't think anyone is ever ready for this." They didn't linger in the doorway. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been offered in countless quiet hours. Martha dressed Elena in the soft blue sweater Ruth had knitted months earlier, the one that always seemed to hold a little extra warmth. She smoothed the baby's hair and held her close for a moment longer than necessary before passing her gently into Nathaniel's waiting arms. The walk to the truck felt longer than she remembered. Snow cracked underfoot, the sky dull and bruised above the trees. She climbed into the passenger seat without protest and folded her hands in her lap. Nathaniel settled the baby into the carrier between them, his gloved fingers careful as he secured each strap. The hush inside the cab felt almost reverent. They drove in near silence, the road winding past bare fields and the slow, frozen river. Martha found herself studying Nathaniel's profile, the way his jaw tightened when they passed the orchard, the way he glanced down at Elena every few moments, as if to reassure himself she was still there. She realized, with a clarity that startled her, that she no longer resented his claim. He had earned the right to stand beside her in this uncertain place. At the courthouse, the sheriff met them by the steps. He offered Martha a steadying hand as she climbed out, and for an instant, she felt the old loneliness she'd carried all these years recede. She wasn't alone today, no matter what the judge decided. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of old coffee and floor polish. They took seats near the door, Nathaniel holding Elena, while Martha folded the child's blanket over her legs. No one spoke. The hush between them felt heavier here, weighted by the knowledge that strangers would soon measure all they had done and decide whose love mattered more. When the clerk finally called them, Martha's heart gave a single hard thud before settling into a slow, resigned rhythm. She rose, smoothing her skirt with hands that didn't quite stop shaking. Nathaniel fell into step beside her. The hearing room was smaller than she expected, the windows frosted over, so only a dull glow filtered through. The judge looked up from a stack of papers and offered a nod that was neither warm nor cold, just necessary. They sat in two chairs set slightly apart. Martha folded her hands tightly to keep them from trembling. Nathaniel settled Elena in his lap, one large hand resting protectively across her small chest. Testimony began: statements from the sheriff, from Miss Hayworth, from neighbors who had written letters on Martha's behalf. The words blurred together, a low tide of formal phrases and careful observations. She caught fragments: exemplary care, bond established, biological parent, best interest. Each phrase seemed to float just out of reach, unreal and sharp all at once. When it was her turn to speak, she stood slowly. Her voice came out rough at first, but she didn't try to smooth it. "I don't claim to be her blood," she began, her gaze fixed on the edge of the judge's desk. "I only claim that I have loved her every day since she came into my life. I don't know if that's enough for the law, but it's enough for me." She felt Nathaniel looking at her, and she lifted her eyes to meet his. There was no triumph there, no pity, only a quiet recognition of what they had both risked by caring this much. He spoke next, his voice clear and steady. "I lost my wife," he said, "and then I lost my child. Finding her again is the only thing that has kept me from losing myself. But I know she is who she is because this woman cared for her when I could not." He paused, his hand tightening on Elena's blanket. "I don't want to erase that, I want to honor it." The judge listened without expression, pen moving in small, precise strokes. When silence fell, it stretched so long Martha thought she might shatter from the waiting. Then he spoke, his voice calm and unhurried. "The court will issue a ruling within the week," he said. "Until that time, the child will remain in her current home, with regular visitation to her biological father." He lifted his gaze to them both. "I trust you will continue to act in her best interests, as you have thus far." Martha let out a slow breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her knees felt weak, but she managed to stay upright. Nathaniel looked over, his expression unreadable, but when their eyes met, she felt a quiet agreement pass between them. They left the courthouse together, stepping out into the sharp winter air. The snow had begun again, fine and relentless. Martha turned her face up to it, letting the cold sting her skin. For the first time in many months, she didn't feel afraid of what would come next. Because whatever shape the future took, she knew this much: they had all chosen love, and that was a decision no decree could ever undo. The snow fell heavier as they made their way back to the truck. Martha moved carefully over the slick steps, her hand braced against the railing. Nathaniel walked beside her, carrying Elena in the crook of his arm, and for a moment, she allowed herself to notice how natural it looked, how easily the child had come to rest against him, her cheek pressed to the soft wool of his coat. They didn't speak as they settled into the cab, the engine rumbling to life in the hush of the courthouse lot. Martha felt her heart begin to slow, as though the finality of the day had drained her of any strength left for worry. The ruling hadn't come yet, but she no longer felt consumed by the question of what it would be. She was simply tired in a way that went deeper than the body. Halfway down the long road back to the cabin, Nathaniel cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet, "for everything you said in there." She kept her gaze on the drifting snow beyond the windshield. "I only told the truth." "I know, that's what mattered." They didn't speak again until he pulled up in front of the porch. He turned off the ignition and sat with both hands on the wheel, staring out into the white. The silence between them felt different, now less uncertain, more like an understanding neither of them needed to define. Inside, the cabin was colder than she'd left it. She stirred the coals in the stove and added kindling until the fire caught, the flames rising with a soft roar that brought heat back into her numb fingers. Nathaniel stood near the rocker, shifting Elena to his shoulder when she began to stir. "She'll be hungry soon," Martha said, her voice husky. "I can make her bottle," he offered, glancing her way. She considered refusing out of habit. But she saw the steadiness in his expression and realized she didn't want to shoulder every small task alone anymore. "All right," she murmured. The formula's in the cupboard above the sink. While he worked, she sat in the rocker, feeling the warmth slowly spread through the room. She studied the lines of his back as he measured the powder and checked the temperature of the water. His movements were tentative but determined, and she thought of how far they had both come since the day he first knocked on her door. When he brought the bottle over, she reached for Elena. The baby settled in her arms with a soft sigh, her mouth already rooting against the blanket. Martha fed her in slow, measured sips, her palm resting against the small, fluttering heartbeat beneath the blue sweater. Nathaniel pulled a chair closer, sitting so their knees nearly touched. He leaned forward, elbows braced on his thighs, and for a time he simply watched the child drink. His eyes were weary but clear. "I never imagined it would feel like this," he said after a while. "Like what?" she asked, her voice softer than she meant it to be. "Like we're all carrying her together." Martha kept her gaze on Elena, afraid that if she met his eyes, she'd say something that would make this fragile peace dissolve. But her throat grew tight anyway. "I think that's the only way she'll grow up, knowing she was always wanted," she said. He nodded, the motion small but certain. When the bottle was empty, she shifted Elena to her shoulder and rubbed her back until she gave a sleepy burp. The child's lashes fluttered as she drifted into the warm, contented doze that always followed her meals. Martha brushed her cheek against the fine down of her hair and closed her eyes. Nathaniel rose and moved to the window, staring out at the river hidden beneath drifts of snow. His voice came so low she almost didn't hear it. "Whatever the court says next week, I hope you'll stay part of her life. I don't think either of us could pretend you haven't become her family." The word settled in the quiet like a stone dropped into still water. Family. It was a word she had once believed belonged only to people joined by blood or by vows. But looking down at Elena's peaceful face, she knew better now. Family was built in quiet rooms and sleepless nights. In the 1,000 choices to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. "I won't disappear," she said. "Not if you don't want me to." He turned, and she saw relief flicker across his features. "I don't," he said simply. She shifted Elena in her arms, feeling the baby's warmth soak into her palms. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to fade, the sky softening to the color of smoke. She thought of all the years she had spent believing she was too old, too solitary, too broken to open her heart again. Yet here she was, her life stitched irrevocably to this child and the man who had come looking for her. As she rocked slowly, the hush between them deepened into something that felt almost like peace. Whatever the judgment brought, it could never erase this small, bright bond that had been woven in the quiet hours of winter. And for the first time since the river had carried Elena to her door, Martha understood she was no longer waiting for her life to return to what it had been. She was ready to let it become something entirely new. The first dawn after the hearing came slow and colorless. Martha lay in bed, listening to the river's muted sigh beyond the walls, her thoughts caught somewhere between dread and a cautious, persistent hope. It was remarkable how the body learned to exist in this limbo, moving through each day with a careful restraint that felt like holding one's breath. When she rose, she found the fire had died to little more than embers. She coaxed it back to life, stacking small logs with deliberate patience, then wrapped Elena in a blanket and carried her to the rocker by the stove. The baby blinked sleepily, her fingers curling into the folds of Martha's shawl, as if to say she already knew this was where she belonged. For a moment, Martha pressed her cheek to the child's crown and let herself simply be grateful. It wasn't long before she heard footsteps out, steady, familiar, and then the quiet knock at the door. She didn't startle anymore when Nathaniel arrived. She only shifted Elena higher in her arms and went to let him in. He stepped inside with a look she recognized all too well. He'd slept as little as she had. Snow clung to the hem of his coat, melting in pale rivulets across the threshold. Without a word, he set down the bag of groceries he carried and lifted his gaze to meet hers. "Any word yet?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not today." He nodded once, and for a moment, the hush between them was so complete she could almost pretend this was an ordinary morning. As if they were simply two neighbors visiting over coffee, and a shared affection for the child who had tied them together in ways neither of them had planned. "I brought more tea," he said after a moment, gesturing to the bag, "and a few things for her." "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than she intended. They settled into their now familiar rhythm. He built the fire higher while she prepared a bottle. When the baby began to fuss, she passed her into his waiting arms, watching as he cradled her with the unstudied care of a man who had stopped trying to prove he was worthy and simply decided to be present. He fed Elena slowly, murmuring little phrases that Martha suspected he wasn't even aware he was saying. She took the chance to sit across from them at the table, her hands folded around a warm mug. Watching them like this, she no longer felt the same ache she'd carried in the beginning. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had been joined by something gentler. Respect, maybe, or the beginnings of trust. When the baby finished her bottle, he settled her against his chest. She fell asleep there, her cheek pressed to the soft wool of his sweater. Nathaniel smoothed a hand over her back and exhaled, as if some tightness in his own ribs had finally eased. "It's strange," he said quietly, not looking up. "For so long, I thought I'd never see her again. That she'd become this shadow I carried around. Now I can't imagine a day without her in it." Martha swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "I used to believe the only way to keep from losing something was never to care for it in the first place." But she looked at the child, her voice lowering. She made that impossible. He lifted his gaze to her, and she saw the same recognition there she felt rising in herself. The understanding that some bonds were formed not in joy but in the shared endurance of grief. When the kettle began to whistle, she rose and poured 2 cups, setting one by his elbow. He looked at it, then at her, and managed a tired smile. "Thank you." They drank in a silence that felt more companionable than awkward. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the bare branches against the eaves. Martha watched the snow blowing past the window and realized that the worst of winter had come and gone, though it hadn't seemed possible in the thick of it. Spring would come again, as it always did, whether she was ready or not. After a long time, Nathaniel shifted, glancing at the clock above the stove. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to stand. "I don't want to be here when the call comes. It should be you who answers." She nodded, understanding without needing him to explain further. The verdict was something they would both have to face, but she knew he wanted to give her the dignity of hearing it in her own space, without an audience. He rose, lifting Elena with care. When he placed her back in Martha's arms, the baby stirred, her small hand brushing his wrist. He paused to rest his palm over hers, and for a moment the three of them stood connected in that quiet, unspoken way. When he stepped back, he didn't look away. "If it goes how you fear, I won't ask you to disappear from her life. I don't think I could bear watching her lose you, too." Martha felt tears sting her eyes. She didn't try to hide them this time. "And if it goes how you fear?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Then I'll learn to live with it," he said simply. "But I'll still come back, if you let me." She managed a nod, though her throat was too tight to speak. After he left, the cabin settled into a hush so deep it felt almost reverent. She sat in the rocker, Elena pressed close, and let the hours pass without measuring them. Now and then she closed her eyes and reminded herself that no letter or judgment could undo the months of small, daily choices that had made them a family. When evening came, she rose to light the lamp, her movements slow but sure. She thought of all the years she'd spent believing she was too late for love to find her again, too tired to risk being needed. But here she was, standing in the warm circle of lamplight, her heart open in spite of everything. And for the first time, she realized that whatever the court decided, she had already chosen her place. She would not vanish. She would not regret the cost of caring. In that quiet room, she understood that this was the life she had waited for, even if she hadn't known how to name it. Morning broke pale and silent, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Martha rose before the first light reached the river, her hands already steady from so many days spent waiting. She moved through the kitchen without hurrying, filling the kettle, laying out the little blue sweater Elena would wear when Nathaniel came to visit. Each small act was a way of reminding herself that no matter what arrived in the mailbox today, the essentials of their life hadn't changed. She had just settled into the rocker, Elena tucked warm against her shoulder, when she heard the crunch of tires in the drive. For one suspended moment, her breath caught in her throat. Then she stood, gathering the baby close, and moved to the window. The mail carrier was climbing from the truck, a single envelope in her hand. She paused near the porch, glancing up at the cabin with a look Martha couldn't read from this distance. There was no ceremony in the delivery. Just a simple, efficient step to the door, and a quiet knock that sounded too gentle to carry the weight of what she'd brought. Martha opened the door, her heart slow but heavy in her chest. "Morning, Miss Holcomb," the woman said, her voice kind but brisk. "Looks like you've got a certified letter." "Thank you," Martha murmured, taking the envelope in one hand. She watched the truck pull away, leaving only the hush of snow falling in slow, determined flakes. She didn't open the letter right away. Instead, she carried Elena back to the rocker and sat down, letting the baby's soft weight settle her. She traced a thumb across the seal, feeling the slight tremor in her own hand. For a long while she just sat there, breathing. She thought of all the hours that had led her to this moment, the night she'd waded into the river, the mornings spent warming bottles, the evenings she'd watched Nathaniel cradle the child they both loved. Whatever the paper inside said, it would never erase those things. When she finally broke the seal, she read each line slowly, her lips moving silently over the legal phrasing, the words blurred at the edges, and she had to blink to steady them. The ruling was clear. Primary custody awarded to the biological father, visitation granted to the guardian who had provided care since the child's rescue. She exhaled, her hand falling to her lap. It was not unexpected, and yet she felt the ache bloom in her chest like something she had been trying to outpace for weeks. Elena shifted against her, a small sound escaping her lips, and Martha pressed her cheek to the baby's fine hair. After a time, she folded the letter neatly and set it on the table. She didn't want to look at it anymore. It felt too final, too certain in its declarations. And yet beneath the sorrow was a quiet certainty she hadn't anticipated. She still belonged to this child's story, not in the way she'd once believed, but in a way that mattered all the same. When Nathaniel arrived just after noon, he didn't wait for her to open the door. He knocked once, and then stepped in, his face drawn tight with worry. One glance at her expression told him what he needed to know. "You read it," he said softly. She nodded, her throat too thick for words. He looked down, studying the floorboards as though the right sentence might be hidden there. After a moment, he crossed the room and knelt by her chair. "May I hold her?" Martha hesitated only a second before easing Elena into his arms. The baby stirred, blinking up at him with a puzzled little frown that made something in Martha's chest twist and loosen all at once. Nathaniel gathered her close, brushing a kiss across her cheek. Then he looked up, his voice unsteady. "I don't know how to say this in a way that makes it feel any softer, but I want you to know, I don't expect you to fade from her life." She closed her eyes, feeling tears slip free. "I wouldn't know how," she whispered. "Good," he said, his own gaze bright. "Because I don't think she'd understand losing you." They sat like that for a long time, the hush between them more intimate than any conversation they'd shared. Eventually, Elena dozed off in his arms, her breath slow and even. Nathaniel shifted, careful not to wake her. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice quiet, "that maybe when she's older, she should know the truth, not just about who found her, but about how she was loved. Even when everything was uncertain, Martha felt something in her chest ease. That would be right, she said. He nodded. And if you're willing, maybe you could be the one to tell her. The offer left her too full to answer. She only reached out and rested her hand over his where it curved protectively around Elena's small body. It felt like the truest kind of agreement, something they didn't need to explain. Outside, the wind shifted, sending flurries in graceful arcs across the yard. The sky was beginning to brighten, a promise of the thaw that would come whether they were ready or not. Martha let herself imagine that spring Elena toddling between them across the grass, her laughter rising clear and unburdened. She didn't know if it would ever be that simple, but in that quiet room, with the child safe in their joined care, she believed they had already done something braver than winning or losing. They had chosen to stay, and for today, that was enough. The next morning dawned with the hush of new snow, clean and undisturbed, as if the world were offering them a moment of grace before everything changed. Martha woke before the first gray light slipped through the curtains. For a time, she lay very still, one hand resting against her heart, trying to memorize the way it felt to belong to this place, to this child, without reservation. She rose and moved through her small rituals, laying a quilt over the rocker, warming milk on the stove. When Elena stirred in her basket, Martha lifted her and pressed her close, breathing in the familiar sweetness of her hair. The baby sighed and settled against her chest with that trusting weight that had become the measure of Martha's days. There had been a time when she would have tried to shut out the ache of endings, to protect herself from feeling too much. But this morning, she let herself feel everything, the sorrow, the gratitude, the fragile hope that none of this love would be wasted, even if it no longer looked the way she had first imagined. By mid-morning, the sound of tires crunching over the snowy track drew her to the window. Nathaniel's truck appeared between the trees, moving slowly, as though he too was reluctant to bring this new reality to her door. She didn't wait for him to knock. She opened the door before he reached the porch. He paused there, his breath showing in short clouds. His face was careful, almost solemn, but when his eyes lifted to hers, she saw how tired he was, how much he had been holding in. "Good morning," he said, voice rough. "Morning." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The hush in the cabin gathered close around them. "I thought." He glanced toward Elena in her arms. "I thought I might stay a little longer today. If that's all right." "It's all right," she said quietly. They settled into their places without discussing it. He built up the fire while she prepared the last of the formula. When she passed the bottle into his hands, their fingers brushed, and she felt an old barrier fall away with a quiet finality. He fed the baby slowly, his gaze never straying from her small, intent face. Martha watched them from across the table, her hands folded in her lap. In the beginning, she had believed sharing this child would break something she wouldn't know how to mend. But watching him now, she saw only the simple, ordinary tenderness of a father learning how to love without fear. When Elena finished, she rested drowsy and content in his arms. He shifted her carefully to his shoulder and turned to Martha, his expression caught between relief and apology. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said, voice quiet. "About how we make this as gentle for her as we can." She nodded, though her throat felt too tight to answer. "If you're willing, I'd like to keep bringing her here some days." He paused, searching her face. "So she doesn't feel like she's being taken away, so she understands she still has this place." Martha felt her chest tighten with something that was not quite pain. It was too tender, too necessary for that. "I would like that," she said. His shoulders eased. "Thank you." They fell silent again. Snow tapped softly at the window. Elena shifted in his arms, her hand brushing the line of his jaw. The gesture was so small, so trusting, that Martha had to look away. After a time, she rose and moved to the rocker. She gestured, and he carried the baby over, settling into the chair as though he'd been doing it all his life. She sat on the low stool near his knee, close enough to feel the warmth rising from the stove. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "the first time you came here?" He smiled faintly, eyes on the child. "I remember thinking you'd never let me cross the threshold." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I know." They sat there, the three of them, with the past unspooling in the hush. It felt easier to look at it now, to see all the ways grief had first bound them together, then slowly transformed itself into something gentler. When Elena finally drifted to sleep, her breath deep and even, Nathaniel looked up, his voice low. I don't know how long it will take me to feel like her father, maybe a lifetime, but I know I wouldn't have found my way here without you. Martha felt something loosen behind her ribs. I wouldn't have, either. They stayed like that until the snow had thickened to a steady curtain beyond the windows. Eventually, she rose to light the lamps as evening pressed in. Nathaniel stood, cradling the baby, and turned once more to her. Whatever happens next, he said, his voice steadier than she had ever heard it, I will never forget you're part of her story. She reached out, smoothing Elena's hair with a hand that didn't tremble anymore. I will never stop being part of it, she said. He nodded, and for the first time, she believed it would be true. As he left, she watched them cross the yard, the child's small face resting against his shoulder. She didn't feel the same hollow ache she'd braced for. Instead, there was a soft fullness in her chest, an understanding that endings and beginnings often arrive together, indistinguishable in their first moments. When she closed the door, she felt the quiet settle around her like a blanket. And though she knew she would miss the daily shape of this life, she also knew she had found something that would stay long after the house was empty, a certainty that no act of love was ever wasted, no matter how it ended. That night, the wind came down from the hills in long, mournful sighs. Martha lay awake listening to it rattle the eaves, her hand resting on the hollow place beside her where Elena's basket used to be. Even knowing the child was safe only a mile away in Nathaniel's rented house, she felt the ache of her absence in every small corner. The quiet was too complete, too sudden, as if the cabin itself had been holding its breath and now had nothing left to say. She rose before dawn, unable to bear the stillness a moment longer. She moved through the kitchen lighting the stove, setting out 2 cups even though she knew only one would be used. Some habits, she suspected, would never leave her. When the tea had steeped and the first light crept across the windowsill, she carried her cup to the rocker and sat in the hush she used to treasure. But it didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like something she'd outgrown without realizing it. Hours passed that way. She watched the pale sky brighten and soften again as snow began to fall in thin, listless flakes. Now and then, she thought she heard a child's laughter in the yard, a phantom echo of all the mornings Elena had woken hungry and curious, her small voice breaking the dawn. It was nearly noon when she heard the crunch of boots outside. She stood, heart stumbling in her chest. Before she reached the door, she heard Nathaniel's voice, low and uncertain. It's just May. She pulled the door wide, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He looked tired, but not in the way he had when he first arrived in town. This was a different weariness, the kind that came from learning how to carry both gratitude and regret without letting either consume you. I thought maybe. He glanced down at the bundled shape in his arms. I thought she might like to visit. The words broke something in her that she hadn't known was still held tight. She stepped aside, one hand pressed over her mouth to steady herself. Nathaniel crossed the threshold and set Elena gently in her basket by the stove, as though no time had passed at all. The baby blinked up at the beams overhead, her mouth forming a sleepy O before she spotted Martha and broke into a drowsy grin. Hello there, Martha whispered, her throat aching. I've missed you. Nathaniel straightened, his eyes shining. She's been. He stopped, swallowed. She's been looking for you in every room. Martha knelt by the basket, brushing her thumb over the child's cheek. The warmth of her skin, the soft sound of her breath, brought a kind of peace that no ruling could ever steal. I was thinking, he went on, that maybe it doesn't have to be all one thing or the other. Maybe she can have both places, both people. Martha looked up, studying the raw honesty in his face. She felt her own heart steady in response. I'd like that, she said. He exhaled as if he'd been bracing for refusal. I don't want her to feel like any part of her has been divided. Neither do I. For a while, they sat on opposite sides of the basket, watching Elena drift in and out of sleep. Now and then, she would reach a hand toward one of them, her touch as light as a breath. It struck Martha that this was the truest shape of love she'd ever known, two people who had every reason to guard their hearts, sitting together in the quiet for no other purpose than to make sure a child felt wholly claimed. As afternoon waned, Nathaniel rose to stir the fire. She watched him move around the cabin with an ease that hadn't been there before. He paused by the shelf where she kept the small keepsakes. She'd saved a knitted hat, a rattle, a folded note in her late husband's hand, and she knew he understood that the past and present were woven together in ways neither of them could ever fully sort out. Before he left, he turned back to face her. "If you want," he cleared his throat. "If you ever felt ready, I'd like you to come to our house, just to see where she'll grow up." Martha felt something in her chest soften. "I think I'd like that very much." He nodded, his relief plain. "Good." He gathered Elena in his arms and stepped onto the porch. Martha followed him out, the cold brushing her cheeks and clearing her thoughts. Snow still drifted down in patient silence. She reached out, smoothing the baby's hair one last time before they turned toward the truck. As she watched them drive away, she was surprised by the steadiness she felt. The sorrow was still there, it might always be, but it no longer threatened to swallow everything else. In its place was something quieter, something closer to acceptance. She stood there a long time, letting the cold sink into her bones. When she finally stepped back inside, she closed the door gently behind her and took a slow breath. The cabin felt different now. Not empty, but waiting. Ready to become whatever it needed to be next. And in that stillness, Martha understood she had not been diminished by the giving. She had been remade by it, stitched back together with a kind of love she hadn't known she was still capable of carrying. Spring came late that year, as if the thaw itself were reluctant to loosen its grip. In the last weeks of snowmelt, Martha found her days folded into a rhythm she hadn't expected. Some mornings, Nathaniel brought Elena to visit, their footsteps crunching over the damp earth. Other times, she walked the winding road to their small rented house, carrying a basket of things she'd saved, a knitted sweater, a jar of jam she'd put up the summer before everything changed. Those visits were never easy. They were not painful in the way she'd once feared, but something quieter, more unsettling, a kind of ache that settled in her bones afterward and made the nights feel longer than they had any right to be. She told herself that was the price of choosing to remain close instead of retreating to the safe confines of loneliness, and she paid it, over and over. One evening, not long after the last drift of snow disappeared from the orchard, Martha walked home in the blue hush of dusk. The sky was just beginning to darken, and for a moment she paused on the rise above her cabin to look back. From there, she could see the smoke rising from Nathaniel's chimney, could almost imagine the shape of Elena's small body pressed to his shoulder as he carried her from room to room. She wondered, not for the first time, what it would be like to have been her mother in truth, to have carried her in her own body, to never have doubted her claim. The thought flickered and dimmed like the first evening stars. She had learned by now there were questions no life ever answered cleanly. That night, she woke before dawn to the hush of a storm moving over the river. Rain drummed against the roof in a steady whisper. She lay in the dark, her heart tapping out the same slow rhythm she had carried for months. It took her longer than she cared to admit to understand what had woken her, the sense that the house was no longer empty. She rose, pulling her shawl tight, and moved to the window. There was no lantern bobbing in the yard, no silhouette crossing the threshold. Just the quiet, unbroken darkness and the rain falling like 1,000 small confessions. She told herself she was imagining it, that she was only hearing echoes of old nights when Elena had slept in the basket by the stove, but the feeling would not leave her. At last, she sat in her rocker, facing the cold hearth. The room seemed to breathe around her. In that stillness, she remembered something Nathaniel had said on the day of the ruling, a line she hadn't let herself consider too closely. "I don't think she'll ever stop looking for you." Martha pressed her palm over her heart. The memory of that child's gaze, solemn and searching, unmoored her in a way nothing else ever had. She closed her eyes and whispered the name she had chosen in those first desperate hours, when she believed love alone could be enough to keep them both safe. Elena. The word seemed to hang in the shadows, as if it belonged to the house itself. When dawn finally broke, she stirred the fire back to life and sat watching the flames rise. She wondered if there would come a day when she'd stop feeling this tether between them, a line so fine it was almost invisible, and yet strong enough to pull her from sleep. Later, as the rain slowed and the pale light crept over the floorboards, Martha rose to open the front door. The yard was empty, just the soft drip of water from the eaves and the churned mud of her footsteps from the day before. But she felt it, all the same, the sense that something of the child remained here, not her body, not her laughter, but the unspoken claim she had laid on this place in Martha's heart. Standing there in the threshold, she understood what she had been refusing to name. She would spend the rest of her life wondering if Elena would grow to remember her as a comfort or a confusion. Whether she would someday come to stand in this yard as a young woman, trying to understand why a stranger's house still felt like a memory. She closed the door and pressed her back to it, the hush settling deep into her bones. And in that silence, neither bitter nor tender, but something more complicated, she realized this was the shape of love she had been given. A love that would never be finished, never fully hers, never quite set free. A love that would always be searching for her in the dark.